This talk is going to give us an early history of the entire Montauk program, some of its background, what its agenda was with regards to the Montauk Time Tunnel and mind control.
There is a hidden agenda we'll have to get into, too.
And the hidden agenda. So why don't we start with the beginning of the Montauk project with Mr. Al Bielek.
The Montauk Project, as we like to call it because of its location at Montauk Point, did not originate at Montauk Point. Its origin actually goes back a few years prior to that, actually to about 1946-47, when World War II was over, and a lot of German scientists were brought in from Europe under Operation Paperclip, some of whom wound up with the CIA, some wound up with various other agencies. CIA, of course, for the record, only was formally entitled to be called that by a charter signed in 1947 by President Truman. But many of these scientists came into the U.S., and a lot of them wound up working in various projects under government behest at a well-known laboratory on Long Island, Brookhaven National Laboratories. Now, Operation Paperclip pulled in thousands of people from Europe, mostly Germany. And many of these scientists have been working on various projects in Europe and in Germany prior to the ending of the war, and they've continued their work. The primary and principal agendas, as I understand it, and as we were pursued at Brookhaven for approximately 20 years, was one, time travel, and secondly, mind control. To go back a little bit earlier than the arrival in the United States, these scientists were working in Nazi Germany on these projects there. They were working on time travel. The Germans allegedly did have a functioning time travel system, though I have not seen anything I would consider sufficient to call it a positive fact that they did, but those are the rumors. They were working on mind control, and there's very strong evidence to show what type of equipments they were using at that time, though it was an earlier phase of it. All of this hardware and experimental work was brought to the United States by the same scientists who worked on it, and it wound up at Brookhaven. Brookhaven, I might also add, quite aside from the fact that they're well known for nuclear medicine and other rather clandestine research projects, which today includes a repository of alien bodies and aliens alive and dead and crashed UFOs and a lot of other strange phenomena, all of which was occurring simultaneously, because Brookhaven is a very large operation and has a lot of money supporting it. It is basically a tax-supported structure, though I'm sure there's a lot of clandestine monies arriving there under the table from various other government sources. But the fact that it is publicly supported by tax money means they must make monthly reports to the oversight committees in Congress and the Senate. And this went on for years. Excuse me. This went on for years, the monthly reports. Nobody read them in Congress or the Senate, but they kept doing their research, that is, these German scientists, were doing their research at Montauk, and this went on into the 60s. And nobody knows really what they were doing until eventually someone started reading these reports in the mid to late 60s. And they were reading things like mind control and this sort of thing, and they said, mind control? These guys might use it on us. Pull the funds on that project and also kick the guys out. That was the orders that came down from Congress and or the Senate. So the scientists were given their notice they were to leave. So obviously they were looking for a new home. Now, parallel to this, a little further east on the island was a place called Montauk Point. And at Montauk Point there was an area called Fort Hero. Fort Hero, of course, was an established military base that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, to about 1900. Its actual history in those first years is a little bit obscure, but we know that they did establish an army base as well as a submarine base, on-water entrances for submarine pens, 2 of them. So the Army and the Navy were established sometime in the first decade of the 20th century at Montauk Point. Fort Hero was an operating base, and it became a little better known during the period of World War II because they put in coastal defense works. They had a large military installation there, the extreme eastern tip of the island. They wanted to defend Long Island in case the Germans, I'm sure they didn't expect anyone else, decided to try and invade the point. They never did, of course, though German submarines did come up there during that period, literally charging their batteries off the point during the day. The crews would wave at people on shore, and people at shore wave at the crews, and it was rather a strange war when the German subs came up in enemy territory, and nobody ever shot at anyone, and nobody did anything except wave at each other and be friendly. It was a strange war indeed in many respects. The war ended. All of these scientists wound up at Brookhaven, and eventually they were kicked out. So they were looking for a new home, and the new home turned out to be Fort Hero. They went out there, and of course, in addition to the Army, the Air Force arrived sometime around 1948-49 to work on some very interesting projects, quite legitimate and quite in the open, namely the Over-the-Horizon Radar Project, the first one, which was the one known as the SAGE Project, the first attempt to develop a radar system powerful enough to read objects over the horizon. It was successful. It was installed all around the U.S. One installation was made right there at Montauk, and that, of course, was the original experimental one. And then, of course, they came up with a later one, the BMUSE project, which was a follow-on. And this was, of course, conducted in the Air Force section of the base using the same radar tower and all the other peripheral buildings and hardware they had. Got into some very powerful hardware in terms of radar systems and the driving systems for the dishes. And this went on until approximately 1968, when BMUSE was considered successful and was installed in Canada, and they started to phase out the SAGE systems. Well, at that point, 1968, they were considering phasing out the SAGE system, but before it was shut down and phased out, the scientists from Brookhaven arrived and gave a pitch to the military there. You might be interested in the research we're doing. We're looking for a new home to continue our research. Well, what are you doing? Basically, we're working on a program which we know you would be interested in. Well, what's that? Well, suppose in a future war you had an enemy that wanted to attack you, and you could push a button, and electronically you could shut them off. In other words, they suddenly decide they don't want to fight you anymore, and the war's over. Nobody fires a shot. Well, they liked that idea, the military personnel, and they said, yes, you may come on our base and continue this research. We're very interested. And, of course, this was the idea of mind manipulation and getting an enemy to surrender by the push of a button on certain very exotic electronic systems. This was demonstrated and used in the Gulf War in 1991, I might add. In any case, in 1968, the system didn't exist yet. But they were welcomed out to Montauk, and they moved in the surface installations, and at a later time underground. But that becomes another story a little bit later on. But they first moved in on the surface and continued their research in mind control and in the time research. And the military essentially, but not totally, moved out. When the Air Force shut down, they largely moved off the base. The Army retained some presence, and the military off and on retained a presence there, but officially the base was closed and considered surplus from 1968 onward. It was held as a surplus base in terms of the War Assets Administration in Washington. And the story circulated after that point that they were going to turn it over to New York State and make a park out of it. Demolish the buildings, perhaps keep the radar tower and convert it into a restaurant. There were a lot of rumors circulated over a period of time. But the Parks Administration did become involved to the extent that they partially took it over and officially sanctioned it as the area which was under control of the New York Parks Administration. That became a very convenient cover for supplying the money to keep the base operating at a later time. But in the period after the military officially moved out, they didn't totally, but the Germans stayed on, and they continued their work on this base, and, of course, basically took over all of the operations. Now, in the period from about 1968 until 1976, many things took place. The military had to expand their operation. The civilian group, the Germans, had to expand their operations. The military shrank their operations. But the military retained a presence and an interest because they wanted to see this project continue. And, of course, it included the Navy now. They got interested.
Al, did the military actually fund the project, or did they have their own funding?
This was a point of great confusion for many years after it was over, and became the basis for a major investigation to find out who did fund this project. There was no money put in by the military. There was no money put in by Congress or the Senate, as subsequent investigations proved. And all of the research there, after the military moved out, was actually funded by the German group themselves. But it was funded in a very strange way. Now we have to go back again to World War II. In 1944, as Germany was starting to collapse and they were losing the war, there was a lot of money being transferred out of the Reichsbank into various places. Switzerland was one of them. But there was a special railroad train containing Reichsbank gold, which was sent into France. And in 1944, this particular train was dynamited in the tunnel, killed about 51 GIs. And the gold on that train, reputedly $10 billion in the gold at the value of 1944 in Europe, which was not $300 an ounce. It was in about somewheres around $25, $28 an ounce, as I remember. That gold disappeared. And one of the principals involved in the research as to what happened to it, why did American GIs get hit with an explosion in a tunnel on our side. This was not on the German side, but on the French side. What's going on here? None other than General Patton got involved in this investigation. Well, he knew, of course, there was gold on that train. It disappeared. They never found it. And he never found the answers to who was in back of this. But he continued his investigation, and it would appear from all of the data that we have, there were those in the Army who were in on it, and it was an inside job, obviously. But he never got, that is, Patton never got to the bottom of who was involved and why this happened. He eventually paid the price for his investigation. He allegedly, according to the public story, died in a car accident in an ambulance later. And the story, as we understand it, was that he was actually killed and made to appear like an accident because he would not give up on his investigation of who was involved in this train bombing in the tunnel and what happened to the $10 billion in gold. Well, we'll jump ahead 10 years. The $10 billion in gold turns up from the information we got much later, and this information, of course, to put it in context, turned up in the 80s. But in any case, it appeared suddenly on a ship off of Montauk Point in 1954 in a storm which sank, and scuba divers went out to the ship and recovered the gold which had disappeared from this railroad train and stored it at Montauk to be used in future operations. At that point, 1954, of course, Montauk was not involved in what we call the Montauk Project. But it was stored there by apparently the military, and eventually that money had a highly inflated value, of course, from 1944 to 1968, was used to fund the project. It was used to pay all the bills. It was used to buy all the equipment because a large amount of equipment had to be designed and built according to the German scientists, who at this point were now working with aliens. In 1954, to put in a little more into the background, there was a treaty signed, the Greada Treaty, by President Eisenhower and a group of aliens at Edwards Air Force Base, in which we agreed not to interfere with each other's civilization. But the key point, which has bearing on the Montauk Project, was that there was an agreement made that we will give technical assistance to each other. Now one may ask, what could we do for the aliens, being that they had technology so far ahead of us that that was the cause for the treaty being signed at the pressure of the military to President Eisenhower. They could give us a lot of help. We gave them some help, which was more in an area totally outside of our discussion, other than to say that it was genetic and biological. But in any case, they were able to give us a lot of technical aid and assistance in other areas. The Germans of themselves were working on time travel. Time travel apparently was partially functional with the Germans during the end of World War II. I might add that the United States also had, in great secrecy, a working time travel system which dated back to 1936-38 period, which came under a project name entitled Project Southern Cross. I'll have to jump out of context if I tell you how I found out about that. But I knew about it. I did not know about it as Al Bielek, but I knew about it as Edward Cameron. In any case, a system was available to function, but the Germans didn't know a thing about it, and they were pursuing their own ends. And at the time when they became involved at Montauk to expand this project, the project director, who was assigned as a technical director, Dr. Hermann C. Untermann, who was a German himself, and came to the United States in 1938 thanks to my father, my real one. He was a project director, and he was told, among other things on this project, which was under government supervision and oversight, and included all of the intelligence agencies giving oversight, that he would have to learn to work with aliens. Now, there would be aliens involved in this project as it transpired from 1968 onward. They would become technically part of it, giving technical assistance, because the, shall we say, the premise for the whole thing, which the government wanted, and the charter, if you will, the bottom line, was they were to explore a time and space to the fullest extent that was possible, using technology which came out of World War II, which came out of the Philadelphia experiment, which came from the Germans' knowledge, and which came from alien intervention and alien technological assistance. Obviously, the aliens knew much more than we did. They knew how to time travel. We knew how to time travel to a limited extent. But they also knew how to do something else, how to transport oneself from point A to point B instantaneously. No rail lines, nothing else in between, but literally transference from point A to B through, shall we say, hyperspace, a wormhole, whatever you want to call the technology. They knew exactly how to do it, and they said, you can build the hardware, we know you have that capability, but you don't understand the theory. We'll tell you how. This was part of the cooperation. So they moved in on the Montauk project, and they became a backbone of it in many respects, because the agenda involving the time tunnel, which was to be a, shall we say, a two-phased project, not only time travel, but space travel, i.e. from point A to point B, whether it be on this planet or off this planet, as was later the case. That hardware was very complex and required an understanding which we did not have at that time, but the alien groups gave us. And of course...
Give us an idea, Al, of who the alien groups were, because there's many, many out there.
Oh, yes, there are many out there. It's very true.
Which ones worked with us on this project?
The ones that worked with us on this, primarily in terms of the computer expertise, was a group called the Leverons, who were perhaps a subsection of the Orion Confederation, from the Orion Confederation and the Orion Constellation. And from there you also get the reptilians, but the reptilians were not directly involved in the project. Some of them showed up occasionally. We also had some of the tall grays involved, which had a, let's say, some minor contribution. There was a very heavy contribution by a group from Sirius A. They were known as the merchants of the galaxy, the hardware builders for the galaxy. If you wanted a spaceship, they knew how to build it. If you wanted some other specialized hardware, computers, whatever, they could build it for anybody if they negotiated the price, whatever it may be. And they became involved in the project in terms of building much of this hardware, and also became heavily involved with the mind manipulation operations.
Did they all seem to get along with each other, or did they stay apart
Basically,
from each other?
they all got along with each other because they were under a directive which said they will get along with each other, because many of them normally would not.
Yeah. And who do you think created that directive?
It is hard to say exactly who laid that directive down, but the coordinator for all of this, the person who was in charge of all of the alien objectives and all of the alien contributions, was a draconian. Stood about 8 feet tall. Actually, he was a little more than that, about 8.5 foot tall, 450, 500 pounds, from Dracus Major. Extremely intelligent, very arrogant type, who lost some of his arrogance as time went on, but he was a coordinator of all alien parts of the project and alien contributions. And he coordinated the alien efforts and the alien connections. The intelligence groups also were in on this, and the, shall we say, the particular corporation which coordinated all of the hardware building and the requirements technically from both the alien and the human side was ITT. ITT Corporation, which, because a result of all of this, was broken up. But that came much later. But they were high in the saddle at that time, you might say, and they were the principal coordinator, helped get the contracts shipped around to various companies in the United States. There was Corning involved in it. There was Westinghouse involved in it. If I recall correctly, RCA, ITT heavily involved. AIL was involved. A couple of computer corporations are involved. All of the contracts for the various pieces and hardwares and systems were handled through ITT Corporation as the principal coordinator. There's an interesting thing about ITT, which we learned later on, was that it was a wholly owned subsidiary, if you will, of a German group, the Krupps. The Krupps owned 53% of the stock of ITT at one time, at least during this period of time. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you can say the whole thing went full circle. The Germans started it in a sense, and the Germans were operating it in another sense in terms of the financing.
Can I go back? Was it the Germans that actually sent the scuba divers out there to get the gold, or was it our Navy people who retrieved the gold? Who was that?
That recovered the gold?
That recovered the gold.
It was our Navy people. It was Navy divers, because there was a Navy installation out there, and it was quite easy for them to send us regular Navy hard hat or scuba divers out. The ship wasn't deep enough to be hard hat. They could do it with scuba.
So then why didn't they just return that gold to the U.S. government? Why did they hide it at Montauk?
That's a very good question. Who authorized Montauk operation in the first place? We don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
There are aspects of this we have no answers for.
Mm-hmm. And this is just one of them.
Right.
Okay.
So the alien agenda was to provide the technical expertise required to produce the time tunnel, and also to help with the mind manipulation, mind control aspects. And this went on so that during the period from 68 to 76, they were building the hardware to create the time tunnel, or the Montauk tunnel as we came to call it. A great deal of hardware had to be designed and built on station, off station, moved in, and of course expand the operations. The major operations are underground, not on the surface, though some of it was still used on the surface. And the principal time tunnel that was developed, phase 2 of it was underground. Phase 1 was actually above ground and used the old radar tower. The original phasing of the system required the use of an RF system, very high powered, and the whole radar tower and all of the equipment above ground fell into this very naturally and was modified in order to be able to do this. Needless to say, they had a lot of failures and a lot of problems. Of course, some of the hardware didn't work and some of the approaches weren't exactly right, and they had to use computers that we had available, which were, of course, at that time period, the IBM 360s and the 370s, and later on, after 76, of course, the Cray 1. But in using the IBM's computers, we had a great problem. We wanted to interface with alien computers, which were brought in to Montauk, in order to provide the data backup and the data manipulation, and to be able to handle the whole system, because it was extremely complex and the mathematics involved was incredibly complex. I don't know if anybody other than the aliens fully understood the mathematics. I knew I might have been able to understand the math as Ed Cameron. As Al Bielek, I definitely did not. Because as Ed Cameron, I had a much better grasp of math than I do today, or even during that period. Mm-hmm. But in any case, to understand it required the alien concepts, the alien ideas, those and the technical staff who could handle the math and build the hardware. Our computers could not handle it, so they ran into a problem where they had to convert a lot of their data into a format which the IBM computers could accept. Later on, there was some help from the Cray 1, and of course, as anyone knows today, the Cray Corporation is up to Cray 6 or Cray 7. If we had had a Cray 7 available then, there would have absolutely no problem interfacing, but the alien computers, probably a Cray 5 could have done it. But that didn't exist at that time.
You interfaced with alien computers?
We tried it. It didn't work.
I see.
So the aliens had to provide IBM data cards and other forms of translation of their mathematics into a format which would fit and work in our computers, and that took almost 10 years. It took from 68 until 76, and actually a little further into that period, into 77, But eventually they got it to work.
Okay, for our listeners, though, there's a name that we hear associated with this project. The Phoenix Project Phoenix was, to your recollection, was that the name of the overall project there at Montauk?
The overall project at Montauk was under the Phoenix Project heading. Project Phoenix came into being approximately 1953 and was actually used as a cover for the ongoing Invisibility Project, which had gone through several name changes. Actually, it started out as Project Rainbow, then was Project Mirage, and then in 53 they changed it to Project Phoenix. Phoenix was a huge cover, if you will, a huge tent to cover many different projects, and it's still in use today as that under that name. So yes, Phoenix was the cover for that.
So you'd have Phoenix 1, Phoenix 2, Phoenix 3.
You could well have, yes, and there probably was for that project because it went through many phases. It's the original one, as they had it, which was using the radar tower as the element for focusing the energy in order to produce the tunnel effect, the time tunnel or the time transfer from point A to wherever. And I might add, for the basis of those who don't understand it, well, did they have a receiver at the other end? No, they did not. It was a very interesting and unique system, and this is why the aliens designed it this way, and why apparently they knew how to do it, and we didn't. We would have thought about, you got to have a transmitter here and a receiver there, which says you got to have a receiver at every point where you want to go. It wasn't necessary with this system. The tunnel became the transceiver, if you will. You go into one end, all of the equipment is at one end, and it focuses the energy on down to whatever point you choose to have it go to, and the product, or I should say the transfer, whether it's hardware, material, personnel, or both, will go through this tunnel and materialize out at the other end, not actually dematerializing in the tunnel, but going through what you would call an extended artificial wormhole, and will come out at the other end, wherever they wanted it. And the reverse would take place if you wanted that person, group, or hardware to come back. You reverse the phase of the thing, so it would pick them up from that end and bring them back to Montauk.
So you're talking about actually fulfilling one of the goals of the Montauk project. That was to build this time tunnel, right?
Yes.
And when do you think that time tunnel was actually completed, built?
The first working system that was tested, from my recollection, was right around 76. It might have been slightly earlier, but 76 was the point where they were doing their first experimental work. Now, I might add, prior to that, there was another aspect of this, which was sort of overlapping and, of course, was in a partial sense independent. And that was the use of the Montauk chair and the psychics to see whether or not, through the computer systems and understanding of reality, you could make a thought reality. In other words, have somebody sitting in the chair, whether it's Duncan or someone else, think of an object, and could you create this through the computer system and the understanding of reality as the aliens gave it to us, and we can put it into our computers. Could you take a thought and make a physical object out of it? If a person thought of a chair, could they create a chair through this transmitter system as an actual physical reality? They did. They were able to do this quite well. At first, when you shut the transmitter off, the thing disappeared. It was a non-permanent thing. Mm-hmm. They finally determined how, and they were able to make a permanent object.
Well, what are some things that were actually thought into an existence?
Typically, they thought of a chair, they thought of a table. I don't know what other objects they might have thought of.
Gold?
They could have.
Mm-hmm.
They could have thought of a number of things. It was more or less of a game at first, just to see whether you could do it. And when they found out they could, it stopped there, because the next phase beyond that was, of course, to see if you could transport an object through the tunnel system. Mm-hmm. And that was, of course, the main goal.
So was the chair the first part of the project for the time tunnel? You had to develop the chair first, and then you were ready to develop the time tunnel? Or did they work together?
Yes, it worked together, but you also had to have the chair and the computer electronics working in the earlier phase, which was the reality manipulation, or create a real object from a thought form. Mm-hmm. That was a precursor to the whole thing, because if you could do that, it meant then you could undoubtedly modify this thing so that an object if I can say it this way, an object could be, in a sense, transferred into a thought form and sent down the tunnel and recreated the other end. That was some of the original thinking. But it actually came out that the tunnel was refined to the point where you sent the object physically with no alteration right through the tunnel to the other end. You didn't have to uncreate it, such as in Beam Me Up Spock or Beam Me Down in the Star Trek model. De-atomize it, put it into some kind of a waveform, and recreate it at the bottom end.
You just throw it in the tunnel.
We just rode right through the tunnel without any alteration.
Give our listeners sort of a picture view of what this chair looked like with all the gadgetry around it.
The chair was very much like what you would envision as a captain's chair on an aircraft, maybe a dentist's chair minus the dental appliances, a comfortable reclining chair which could be tilted and you could recline comfortably because the operator in that chair, who was a very sensitive psychic, had to be comfortable. And they weren't strapped in, they were just laid down in the chair and they would tilt back and they were put into their proper operating state. And around it, in fact, the chair would have coils wound into it for picking up the body energies, and the early system used a form of antenna very much like a delta T antenna. And when I say delta T, let me describe what a delta T antenna is. Envision a pyramid like the Great Pyramid of Egypt with a apex up on top. Then take away the pyramid and just look at the four corners, like you had 4 rods coming from the apex down to the base, and around the base you had 4 more rods in a square in the actual shape and form of the pyramid with the same angles. Now this would be a device where you had the form, but in addition to the form, you had coils wound around it.
Isn't that half a tetrahedron?
Perhaps you could call it that.
Yes.
Because in the original form, we only used half of them, of the delta T. Actually, it was the 1/2 section. The full delta T required coils in XYZ axis, where you had the 2 of them base to base, so that you had 2 apexes out here, and you had the 2 bases facing each other. But that was not for pickup. That was for another purpose. To pick up the energies of the psychic in the chair, you had one conical pyramidal type structure which was wound with coils for energy pickup. They weren't to put any energy out, they were to absorb the energy coming out from the psychic. They did it in many ways. They tried many different systems, but basically it was to pick up XYZ coordinate energies from the person's head, because the human head does radiate energy, both electric field and magnetic, and you had to pick these up with very sensitive amplifiers. They used cryogenic amplifiers at first. They had to have very, very low noise levels. Then they finally shifted to something which was picking up certain specific bands at RF.
How far away from the subject's head were these devices?
The coils were basically within 2 to 3 feet of their body. As far as the head was concerned, they wanted to get them as close as possible, so typically they're about between 1 foot and 18 inches.
So the psychic didn't wear a hat or anything?
No, they did not wear a hat. There were some experiments done with that, using a helmet. That didn't work too well, because it was too uncomfortable with the psychic, and if they were uncomfortable, they didn't function properly. They had to be completely comfortable, they had to be in a state of reverie, and you couldn't have any physical distraction from that state. And a helmet was a physical distraction, and anything too close to them is a physical distraction, because they can sense the coils out there if they're too close. So that was a setup, and there was XYZ coordinate coils. These energies, which were very low level, but nevertheless there, were amplified, and they went through their own processing system, and eventually they were fed into the computers. Now, how did this work? You can't just pick a psychic up off the street, pardon the expression, but pick up a sensitive and psychic and say, we're going to train you to do this, and have them sit down on the chair, have them think of something, like, for example, creating the chair, a physical chair from the person's thought form. You can't just say to the psychic, think of a chair, and then automatically a chair appears, because the computers will not of themselves understand the person's thought processes. The person has to think, if you pardon the expression, in computerese. They have to think in a form which the computer recognizes. Now, this required additional training. All of those sensitives, all of those chair psychics, if I may call them that, had to go through a very special training process in another location down off the shores of the Potomac, which we call the Potomac Facility. It was called by various names. In that facility, there was some very special training processes, and it was, I don't know how long that place was in operation. It's still in operation today, as far as I know. But it was there at the time when we needed it. And what it did, it took people in, put them through special computer training systems, high-speed training, plus capabilities of exciting and improving the thinking capacity of the brain, which required certain chemicals being injected into their systems, and going through literally 5 phases of this kind of training. If anyone has seen the movie, the
Lawnmower Man.
The Lawnmower Man, that is exactly the kind of facility I'm talking about, because that was based on the actual facilities of the Potomac that we had down there. And I went through it because I had to know exactly what these guys were going to go through, made some improvements on me. But it was cut off at a certain point. They didn't want the people to go too far.
Are you saying you actually went through that
I
facility?
went through the training facility
program?
itself. I went through the training so that I would know what Duncan and all the others had to go through and what the effect was.
Did
So
you
theoretically, I could sit in a chair and do the same thing.
Did you ever go in the chair yourself?
I don't recall that I did, other than for a test program just to see if the equipment was working.
Okay.
However, they had to do this because what it did, it gave them the ability to understand computer language, whatever form you wanted to use, whether it's COBOL or any of the others.
Yeah. How in the world do you think like a computer?
You don't normally. That's the problem.
That's what I'm trying to. I mean,
Normally a human doesn't, but you see, if they put them in the proper state of reverie, you access their subconscious, plug in a certain program, a series of them, in fact. It's mind control of another level. It's mind control where they're not controlling the mind, you're giving the mind new abilities.
So
that the person can think in the normal form when they're in their normal state of mind, like they're normally conscious and talking like you and I.
Mm-hmm.
But if they were to be used for this program, they were put in a special state of mind where they access this training in the subconscious, where any thought that they were given, any idea which was presented to them, was converted into a computerese format. As I say, whether it's COBOL or any other program, didn't matter. Whatever the program they wanted to use, it came out of their minds in the subconscious level. This was picked up by the coils, and this was understandable by the computers. They had to think in a computer language. And this was done at a subconscious level, not the normal conscious level.
And to your knowledge, about how many people were trained that you worked with to run this chair?
There were at least 6 that I know of, but I was told there were a lot more than that as time went on. I would give an estimate, because it was not everyone that could be trained to this. They were specially selected to begin with. I would give a hypothetical guess at this as about 20. I knew about 6. Mm-hmm. But there could have been more, there could have been less than that.
Is Duncan the only one that you remember the name of?
No, there was one other that was used in that program. In fact, there are 3 I know of that were used in that program. One I have more or less track of today. The 3rd I've lost track of. Another man that may have been involved in that program I've met occasionally on Long Island, but he became involved in some side issue because some of these guys had multiple talents. In fact, some of these people using the chair did have multiple talents, and they used them elsewhere. They didn't believe just using a single talent. If you were multi-talented, they used them all. One of them, as I think of now, was a guy who was known as the drummer. He was in one of the bands down there. They had some very good musical bands that did a lot of recording, but this had nothing to do with the chair, except that some of the people in the chair had other things they did. Some of it was for pure recreation.
That's interesting. Do you want to keep those names sort of quiet at this point?
Basically, yes, at this point.
Okay. Now, another goal or agenda for Montauk was mind control.
Yes.
And we'll get back to the chair. First of all, on the chair, you interfaced it into computers, basically, right?
Yes, the chair interfaced the computers.
And
from that, the person who was in the chair was given instructions
right.
as to what they wanted to do that day or that session. Like, let's say they wanted to run a tunnel over to Tibet. I'm just being hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time as today, the today of that particular point, they could, in their mind, think of the tunnel is going to go to such and such point in Tibet. They would be given the coordinates, and the equipment would be turned on, and the person would think about it. The tunnel would open up, and then, of course, the tunnel would terminate at the other end in Tibet. And if they wanted to send a person through to do some exploring or send a truck there with something, they could.
Where would the tunnel physically open up?
The early work on this, but not the important work, the early work on this was using the radar tower with an RF system, excuse me, using the...
You're talking about that big radar tower?
The big radar tower with the huge antenna on it, which at that point was still servo-controlled.
Mm-hmm.
They've long since lost the capability of steering it. But it was servo-controlled. They could focus it down towards the ground, and the distance was sufficient to the traffic circle, which shows up in the series of pictures I've done,
mm-hmm.
was a focal point. And if they wanted to transport a person somewhere or an object that we put in that traffic circle, the antenna would be fed the appropriate RF signals and so forth, and all of the corrected aspects. And that person or object would be picked up, transported, and go through the tunnel to wherever it went through. This was not too good. It was sloppy, and it wasn't a true tunnel as we used it later.
Did we burn up a lot of people? Or?
It burned up people. They burned up equipment. People and equipment disappeared in hyperspace, shall we say, and were never recovered. They had a few accidents like that in the early days. They finally decided the RF system was not the way to go, and they converted it to the tunnel as we all knew it from about 1978 on in the underground, where they built two back-to-back delta T antennas in two forms. The usual form was that they had the two bases of the pyramids, if you will, back-to-back. There was another form they used where the two apexes of the pyramid were point-to-point on a straight axis. In other words, they weren't tilted in relationship to each other. They're on a 90-degree axis, a straight zero axis to each other. Mm-hmm. And they used, apparently, both of these. They were driven with their own coil systems, and I don't know the whole configuration. In fact, I know very little about the configuration of the electronics for generating this tunnel, but it worked. In that they were embedded, believe it or not, these delta T antenna systems were embedded in the rock underground. How they got them in there, I don't know, unless they chiseled it out and then filled it in later. That aspect I don't know or understand, but when those things went on, and you got a green light on a certain piece of equipment, there in the room, if you will, where the tunnel would suddenly appear, the wall would disappear and you would see this tunnel, approximately 8 feet in diameter.
Was that physically close to the person in the chair?
No, it was not close to the person in the chair at all. It was quite a distance away.
Wow.
Because they didn't want the radiations from that tunnel affecting the chair personnel. Actually, the chair person was on the surface, usually in a room or a building on the surface.
Oh, not underground?
No, this tunnel operation was all underground.
But the person in the chair was above ground?
It was, at least initially, as I remember. Now, whether they ever moved him off the ground level, I'm not sure.
Al, who in their right mind would ever volunteer to be a subject for the early testing of this time?
That is a very good question.
I mean, they see the guy in front of them gets zapped out in hyperspace, never to come back. Who would raise their hand and say, okay, I'm next?
That was a problem in the earlier phases. I am sure some of the subjects of these early tests were not volunteers, just as the Montauk boys in the early phases were not basically volunteers. They were sort of booted into it.
Seems like, though, they would do a dog or a cat or something like that.
They did do that at first. They did use some test animals.
But why even use humans until they know the system had been perfected?
Well, they assumed it was working properly at the first times when they used the humans, but things happened after it was turned on, and everything looked like it was functioning correctly, and all the meter readings said the proper things, but you can't tell whether that tunnel went all the way to the point where you want it to go, or even if it was terminating where you wanted it to terminate. You couldn't be sure in the earlier runs whether that thing was stable in the middle. And this was the problem. You could be transported down there, and suddenly they hit a point of instability, and they're gone. They're atoms in space. Or the tunnel could be functioning properly all the way through and develop an anomaly while it's operating after somebody's in the tunnel. It was not instantaneous, point A to point B. There was a finite time period. It was a matter of anywhere from seconds to maybe possibly a minute, depending upon where they're going or how far they're going. If they're going across the galaxy, as they did later, that could have been perhaps about 2 minutes in subjective time, possibly even on a wristwatch, for that matter.
Well, as you know, I interviewed Preston Nichols, and he said that he actually went through one of these time tunnels into the future. Said it was the worst experience he ever had. He wanted to die.
I remember him saying that once.
he said it was he was compressed down to nothing. It hurt like hell, and then boom, expanded out again. And when they brought him back, he said, "Don't ever do that to me again." Now, was that pretty much the common experience for people?
Not as I remember it. That was probably an early phase.
Okay.
There was a lot of, shall we say, improvements of the system as time went on, a lot of modification. In the last 2 or 3 years, it worked very smoothly. From about 1980 on, it worked very smoothly without any of these kind of problems. I don't recall that there was any compression as you went through the tunnel, but then again, if I or an object were going through the tunnel, you might not be aware of it. Now, Preston something was wrong. Whether it was wrong in terms of the tunnel function at that time, or one of the characteristics of it at that time, what he reported was not what was usually reported, as I recall. So he might have been an early anomaly in terms of the functioning, or it could have been something particularly about him, because he is himself a strange hybrid. He is human, but he's also a little bit more than human, because he's been off planet, and he's been worked on by the Pleiadians, and he admits this in one of his books. And he was at one time very ill, very sickly, the typical sickly kid. They don't know if he's going to live or not. And suddenly he was healthy as a horse. Somebody worked on him, and what else did they do him besides improve his health? There might have been something done to him which created the problem for going through the tunnel. I can only say that as a hypothetical idea. I don't know if that was the case, but something caused him to have some terrible reactions. I don't remember anybody else reporting this.
So about what year do you think they moved to the Delta T antennas?
That was about 78.
And where did that technology come from, to your recollection?
As I understand it, and Preston said this, basically that's Pleiadian technology. There were Pleiadians there, but they weren't there very often. And there was a special group of Pleiadians which show up occasionally, just as there were groups of other aliens that showed up occasionally who didn't seemingly do much or didn't spend much time there. There was a group of little grays that showed up periodically. They didn't do much of anything except get underfoot. There was a group of very human-like aliens from Antares. Couldn't tell them from a human. They were totally naked. They looked like a human. They didn't do anything. They were very friendly, but they didn't seem to do anything. Whether they were there strictly as observers, I don't know. I don't know what their reason for being there was.
Well, they probably just didn't have a reason to interface with you, so that's why you saw it as them not doing
anything. That could well be.
Well, one of the other comments was that everything is very compartmentalized in this operation.
Very true.
Could you comment on that?
Things were very compartmentalized, not 100%, but largely. The more, how shall I say, the more sensitive areas of research were highly compartmentalized. The Montauk boys were not, as such, allowed to know what was going on in terms of the tunnel operations. The people went through the tunnel operations because of other things they worked on, such as myself would know about the Montauk boys, and I knew about the music rooms. I used to wander into them because that was recreation. It was on limits to anyone. the genetic research I knew very little about, except there was some going on there. And I believe that got out of hand and was moved off the base because it was interfering with the main goals. There was a lot of genetic research done elsewhere that I know of, but that's not what we're discussing here in terms of Montauk. But there was a lot of compartmentalization in the sense that they didn't let any one specific person know everything except the station manager. That is Jack Pruitt. He had to know what was going on in all respects because he reported to the next up the line, who was the technical manager, who was down there once in a while, and that was Herman C. Unterman. He was the technical director of the project. He reported to somebody else up the line.
Do you know who that was?
No, I don't know who the next in line was because I had occasion to go through the whole chain once. And the person above him was a man by the name of Dr. Clarkson, as I recall. And there was the man who was at the top of the whole administrative heap of this thing, whether he was stationed also at Lincoln Labs in Boston, Mass. area or not, I don't know. But the top administrator, I never got to meet. I may have known who he was then. I don't now. But what his function was, since the man I did interface with at one point was very high up in the chain and appeared to have authority over everything except that he had to make phone calls occasionally, which meant there was somebody over him. The upper levels of that chain of command, I don't know what function they served. I don't know who they reported to. Mm-hmm. But there was a chain of command. And on the one occasion I had to go up to the next to the top, and that was at the time when I changed the whole Montauk Boys program, which we can get into later.
Okay. Now, give us a visual tour of what the Montauk base looked like.
Okay.
Both above and below ground.
Above ground, there's a lot of photos to show this, but above ground, if you were to drive out to the Montauk base on Highway 27, 27A, I believe, is the one that goes through the town, and there's another 5 miles to the point, you would come to the point where the road goes around in a circle, and there's a park there. You would park your vehicle, and assuming, as it was from the period of 1983 to about almost 93, it was almost totally open on the surface. You could walk through that little park, find a section where the base gates were down, and walk in and walk all over the base. On the surface, there were a lot of military barracks and a lot of military buildings, which were leftovers from the time when the Army and the Air Force and the Navy were there officially.
Did the Army Corps of Engineers originally build that base?
Probably from the beginning. The original base was built around the period of 1901, 1902. I don't have any records of that. And it constituted a surface base and apparently one level underground. In the period around 1930 to 33, the Army Corps of Engineers got in big time, and I saw the plans for that at the time of a meeting we had out there, which was in May of 1986, with people who were involved with Senator Barry Goldwater, who sent his own little investigative crew out, brought the plans for the base with him. Highly classified, I'm sure, but he was allowed to have them, and I did look at them. And they showed that at least as of that time, there were 6 levels, one on the surface and 5 more underground. These were built by the Army Corps of Engineers, the additional underground bases, in the period around 1930 to 33, and they built them in a very unusual way. They built them above ground, as it existed prior to that 1930 point. And when they were done with all of the construction, all the steel, concrete, and everything else, they built a hill. They poured earth, huge amounts of earth in on top of everything, covered it over, planted trees, bushes, shrubs, whatever, to make it look like it had always been a hill there. And you can see from the driving out from the town that there is an artificial hill there. And if you get the right point, you can see there's a hill which doesn't seem to quite fit the terrain, but it looks very natural. And that was basically how they built the base up. The original surface works were buried underground, and they built a new surface function, if you will, in that period around 1933. And, of course, during World War II, it was heavily occupied. And only a few people, I'm sure, at that point knew there was anything underground. But that's what you would see walking around on the surface. And to get to the underground, there were walk-in entrances in certain buildings. regular stairways. Then the radar tower, there was an elevator that went down to all the levels. It was a very large freight elevator, could carry approximately a ton load, and perhaps more than that. All of that was available, and if you went down to the underground, as we did at more than one point, there were various levels, and as we called it in the basement, which was a lower level of the underground, they had all of the power conversion equipment, all the very heavy electronic equipment, which they wanted down there in the basement for shielding and for other purposes. And occasionally, if the cooling requirements got heavy enough, they'd flood it with seawater. The equipment could be flooded with seawater down there if they had to. And occasionally they did do that. But it's not normal. It was below sea level.
Okay, when you went below level, what did it look? Was it very plain? What were the walls like?
In some areas, are very plain concrete.
Like cylinder concrete blocks, or?
No, it was poured.
Poured concrete.
Poured and reinforced with steel.
Okay. No decoration or anything?
The only decorations that ever showed up there was what the personnel put up as time went on. Like comedy relief, some kind of relief on bare concrete walls, graffiti, if you will. There was not much of that.
So at the end, how many total levels were there underground?
6 at that time, and they built 2 more since then, and that was in the period between 1983 and 87. As I understand it, there were 2 more underground levels built since, so there's 8 levels underground today. But up to 83, there were 6.
Did you ever go down to the deepest levels?
Yes.
And about how large would you say those lower levels were?
In terms of ceiling clearance, or
in terms
how far
of
they extended?
Width, yeah. How far they extend?
Ceiling level was typically about 12 foot, because they might have room for a lot of equipment and cooling and all of this, but some of that equipment generated large amounts of heat. Extended for hundreds of feet. In fact, I would say that the bottom 2 levels extended for over a mile. It was quite extensive. And they merged with natural cavern systems, because under Long Island, as part of even the Montauk operation, there were a lot of natural caverns which sort of faced onto and actually joined into the artificial constructions, actually merged into the natural cavern systems.
Did they use technology to build this underground facility that we don't have access to today, or is this something that they can easily do right now?
This was something you could easily do now, and the technology of the 30s was quite up to building what they had down there in terms of just the structure. The equipment was moved in later, was another matter, but the structure, there was no problem in building anything we had there, like any bridge building or tunneling we could do in the 30s. In fact, earlier than that, in the turn of the century. Any of that type of technology would have been sufficient to build the physical facility of the underground Montauk.
Was it moist down there?
At times it was.
Cold?
At times it was, but other times it was hot, depending on how much equipment was running.
Where was the ventilation then? I mean, that would give it away.
It's a very good question, because they hid the ventilators very well, stationed around various parts of the mound, if you will, in the center of the island, the center of the base. There were ventilator shafts, but they were well concealed. In some cases, they came out into other buildings on the surface.
Yeah, well, that would make sense. Okay. So sort of a plain, as I think of it, like an army base, everything's very plain inside
Very
there.
plain is true. Even the buildings on the surface that were used, and as we examined them after it was over, but even before it was over when we were actually there, the buildings were plain military, and any garnishments was done by the personnel who lived there.
At the height of its operation, how many employees would you say, or people, were actually working at this Montauk base, both above and below ground?
They had a fairly large office staff, which were civilians brought in, sworn to secrecy, of course.
And that was above ground?
That was all above ground.
Right.
They had considerable offices. The office I worked out of, there were about 50 people there. I would say the total civilian personnel at the peak of operations was probably around 200. And that was a pretty good staff to keep track of and to keep quiet.
So there were 200 people below ground?
No, this was above ground as office staff.
Okay, 200 above ground. How many below ground?
that varied from time to time. That was hard to know unless you had access to all the facilities. So I'll have to take a second guess on that and hypothesize it's probably around anywhere from 300 to 500.
That's a lot of people.
Oh yeah, but remember, it's a lot of space, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of area down there, and there was multiple projects.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So how do you keep all those people?
I didn't.
Wow. Well, yeah,
That was
you're
Jack
one-
Pruitt's job,
to
as
keep
well
them
as
all
those who
quiet.
worked under him.
Oh, it was Jack one of his responsibilities to make sure nobody talked?
It was his responsibility to coordinate all of the efforts. The civilian personnel, all the personnel who were brought in had to be passed by him. They had to go through various screenings, not only physical screenings, but of course psychological, security, all of that sort of thing.
But didn't they have the technology to sort of wipe your memories clean?
Very much so.
And so you think they ran everybody through that program when they were done with them?
When they were done with them, were about to leave, whether they were told that your job is over or whether they decided I want out. In any case, they had the debriefing, which was, of course, erasing their memory of anything they did there on the base.
And do you have any recollection of how they actually did that?
It was electronic equipment. How they did that specifically in terms of the equipment was very similar to what was used on the Montauk boys later on. At the early phases, there was hardly anybody that left. Later on, there were people that started to turn over. Let's say around 81 onward, there was turnover because the heavy construction was long since over. The electronic installations and construction was over. There wasn't much modification from 1981 on. And some of the staff was not needed anymore because a lot of it was needed for just logistics, keeping track of equipment coming in, where it was going, was it paid for, issuing contracts and all of this sort of stuff. That required a rather sizable office staff for quite a few years. When they had it all built and it was all functional and there wasn't much changes being made anymore, then they didn't need that staff and it was tapered down.
You said hardly anybody left. What did they do with them?
Hardly anybody left in the early phases.
Mm-hmm.
Erasing their memories at that time, I don't know exactly how they did it, unless they used the old hypnosis and chemical injection techniques, which basically was scopolamine. Since there were a lot of Germans there, I'm sure they had their own techniques. Scopolamine, of course, was a German drug from IG Farben. Very effective with hypnosis to wipe memories.
But not as effective as this electronic means. Would they wire you up, or what did that look like?
Basically, any of the techniques that they used later on was, and in the middle phases, was wiring you up into a machine which was much like an EEG machine, i.e. the pads you put on your head, little electrical contact pads on your head and various parts of your body in order to monitor the energies, and also not just to monitor what was coming out, but to put in an energy field which would put you into the proper state, a semi-orgastic state where they wanted to wipe memories, not install memories, but wipe a memory.
Did you ever actually see this procedure being done?
I think I saw it once.
Okay.
But I was not particularly interested in it, so I didn't stick around for it because I had a lot of other things to do then. And of course, eventually my turn came, the debriefing for the Montauk thing. But that was rather hasty and hurried, and the debriefings of the personnel after the project was down was not very thorough. It was, nearly everyone remembered what had happened within 2 years to 3 at the max.
Well, so we've been talking about the Montauk Time Tunnel as one of the main goals for this project. Would you say that they were quite successful in their use of this tunnel?
Extremely successful. Probably more successful than they expected in their wildest dreams, because here you had a tool which enabled you to go to the moon and do exploration on the moon, or inside if you knew there was an inside and where to get into it.
So it was really a space-time tunnel.
Absolutely, a space-time tunnel tool, if you will, to explore space and time simultaneously. You could go to Mars, you could go to any of the other planets, you could go to another solar system, you could go across the galaxy.
You could go to the Civil War, you could go
back to the Civil War, and they did.
And you could go in the future, right?
I'm sorry?
And you could go into the future.
Oh, yes, very much so. And you could by using either Montauk or related facilities, because they did build parallel facilities. Some of them were modified, as was Montauk, because there were other SAGE radar systems around the country. There were 26 of them. Most of them are later phased out. Some of them put into storage, but as the case was, there were originally 26 functional. So they had other facilities available to modify to the same format if they wanted to, and they did a few. So they had other facilities they could use, and some of these were used in time travel. What facility was used for going back and, let us say, looking at the Civil War and doing a number on it, I don't know. I don't know which facility. I know still today one of the people who was involved with that project. They could have used other locations for other projects, but as has been mentioned most recently, they used Montauk to take a look at World War II. It's of course long after the fact, but they used it to go back and look at World War II and see the outcome as it came out, as the history books recorded. Was this really the most optimum output and the most optimum way the war ended? And they looked at other scenarios and tried them out, apparently. What if, pardon the expression, what if Hitler had won the war? I don't know if they actually went ahead and tried that scenario out. I was not aware of it. I've heard of this from other sources since. But they could theoretically go back and do enough manipulation in time, putting the right people in the right places, to see to it that better information was given to Hitler, that perhaps he was cured of his ailments of 1941, and that he monitored his war efforts more closely and didn't make some of the foolish mistakes he made. He might have won the war. So if you manipulated so he won the war, what would be the outcome? This was what they were looking at. Was this a desirable thing? Would it have been better for us all the way around if he had won the war? Or suppose somebody else had done something different than they did?
Well, Al, I have to say that if indeed this is true, it's scary.
Oh, definitely it's scary.
Because it begs the question, what is reality?
Very much so. This gets down to a very basic question. What is reality? Whose reality?
Yeah. Now, you've had years to pontificate on this, to think about it. What is reality? And in your opinion, what is reality?
Well, reality, as we accept it physically, the time of birth, the time of death, if you don't have the experience of going through a Montauk syndrome or a Montauk experience or anything near it. So as you were born, you live a physical life, time flows at an even rate, things happen normally. Everybody thinks they know what normal is. That you have physical laws governing reality and so forth, and time flows at a relative rate that's quite measurable. And you have a life, and eventually you die, and other people come along, and so forth. And there are history books which record what's happened. This is what we accept as reality. Now, suppose, and I'm saying the supposed for a reason, I hypothesized that somebody could manipulate time so that time doesn't flow at the same rate, or maybe time folds back on itself, or maybe your timeline, as you remember it, actually has a kink or two in it you're not aware of, and you did things you've totally forgotten or you have had erased from you. Suppose you live the equivalent of 2 lifetimes in one lifetime, but all you remember is the one lifetime, and I know of particular examples where this has happened. Then it becomes a case of what is reality. What you think is reality may not be reality at all, because you've lost memory of some things that you have done, because you were manipulated into not remembering it. Now let's look at it in another sense. Suppose time is not a totally linear function. Suppose that it's a closed loop. There are those who theorize this, including Einstein. He says everything is curved. We're living in a curved universe, and he said it himself years and years ago, that if you were to be able to go forward in time in what you think is an absolutely straight line, and were able to go far enough and fast enough, you'd eventually come to the point where you'll be hitting yourself in the back. Literally, you'll be going around in an enormous closed loop, which is what he said. The universe is a closed loop. Time is a closed loop, and so forth. Therefore, what is reality? If you can go down that stream of time and look at it, yes, let's say 50 years from now, there's humanity there. Certain things have occurred and happened. Society may be much different than as it is today. But those people there would have a history of the past as to what happened from the point where you were. It may or may not agree what you think is going to happen. And these people may have false information, they may have real information. Now, suppose you can go forward to that point, talk to these people, and say, from their past, this is what really happened, and so forth. And you have altered history in the sense of you have altered their conception of what has happened in the past. Now, suppose from our time, we could go back literally to the time, let's say, of the Civil War, and interpose ourselves as a group or whatever, and make certain changes in their history, then you could change the outcome of the Civil War. So this being the case, then what happens thereafter?
Yeah, then you would have to immediately change what's in everybody's mind. For instance,
it happens automatically.
It would have to be automatic. Like, let's just say you went back to the Civil War and
you wouldn't know what happened.
You had a machine gun.
Mm-hmm.
You brought it with you. You gave it to one side. That one side was able to use it to their advantage and win the war. And now all of a sudden, I open up this history book, and on page 54, there's a picture of that machine gun that wasn't there a second ago.
Exactly.
Is that how it would work?
That would be essentially how it would work. You can manipulate history that way if you have the hardware and the capability and want to do it. Now, looking at this from this point forward, well, let us say, take it back 50 years. Let's take it back to 1945, when the war ended. And according to history books, we know how it ended. But let us hypothecate a world control group, which is not really so much of a hypothesis, but nevertheless, I want to say, let's hypothecate a world control group that wants to be able to control, from that point on, the outcome of history through the next century, from, let's say, 1945 to 2045. Now, we have hardware which says we can time travel, and that is perfected in a number of years from the point of 1945. And these people know it's coming along. They get control of this hardware. What is to stop them from going ahead in time, seeing how things are going to come out, and saying, this is not the way we want it to be. We want it to be this way. Then they go forward in time and they do the manipulations which are necessary, or they go backtrack a little bit and change certain people, certain groups. They may murder certain people. They may see that certain people are grown. They may see certain changes in science and technology are accelerated. Others may be suppressed. So that you shape history as it is going along to achieve a pre-desired goal.
But wouldn't it also be possible that they go back and say, kill the Antichrist, when the Antichrist is a baby, and then they zoom back up to the point where the Antichrist does all the trouble and they find out that nothing has changed?
That, I understand, happened.
You're kidding. I just made that up.
You may have just made it up, but I understand it actually did happen. Bill Cooper used to tell that story. The guy who used to lecture all over the country, excuse me, and hasn't anymore, got into the subject of time travel once, and I do not know now whether he made this as a public statement or at a private group meeting. But he said there were those who played around with time travel, and the Navy hypothecated, well, we know who the Antichrist is now. The Navy didn't explain who it was, but they said we know who it is. Why don't we go back into the past and murder his father before the father married? Therefore, if this is accomplishable and we can do this, the Antichrist should cease to exist. So according to Bill Cooper's story, they did this. They had the time travel equipment available, which I know they did, and went back and they assassinated the father of the Antichrist before he married. So theoretically, there was no marriage and there was no Antichrist kid born. Didn't affect the person who knew it was the Antichrist. So at that point, the people who pulled this experiment went scratching their heads and finally went to some of the quantum physicists, who they figured were the best possible people to come up with an answer. Said, what happened? What went wrong? They came up with an answer which I can't say I fully accept. But nevertheless, their answer was, you're dealing with quanta of energy, you're dealing with quanta of space, of time, of everything. Consequently, you only affected the local area, and you didn't affect the outcome. Even though you killed his father before he married, you didn't affect something else which has already happened. Now, this, to me, doesn't make sense.
Well, now, his wife could have been pregnant at the time, too.
That's right. His wife could have been pregnant. Maybe there are other factors that he didn't know and we don't know.
That's right.
It's a very complex scenario, and I don't necessarily buy this quanta of energy at the time, therefore it's not going to be transmitted to the future, because there's too much evidence to the contrary. Too many other people have tried this and have manipulated the future, manipulated time. I've seen things in my own lifetime that had taken sudden strange turns where, let us say, a piece of information I know I had disappeared under circumstances it cannot explain. Disappeared out of my files, disappeared out of a locked location. I know I didn't throw it away. I know nobody came in and opened it up. Why did it disappear? How? I can't explain it. I know other people have had the same experience. These usually are very critical, important pieces of information which somebody doesn't want to survive or to be disseminated, whatever the case may be. And people disappear. It's just well known, of course, in the annals of the FBI. People disappear. What happens to them? We don't know. 1 million, as you said, 2 million kids, and more than kids, of course, disappear. Adults disappear. 2 million kids a year disappear. How many adults in addition to that, I don't know. And they find out about a few of them. Yes, of course they will. But they said about 1 million kids a year, we never find out what happened to them. And how about all the adults that disappear under mysterious circumstances? Nobody ever finds anything out about them.
Is the number that large? 1 million kids a year?
2 million.
2 million a year?
A year.
U.S.?
U.S. That's out of the mouth of the FBI itself. They don't put that figure around publicly.
Where did you hear that?
That came from Phil Schenider, who investigated. After I told him about the Montauk boys, he went to the FBI, among others, but the last one he went to was the FBI, and he said, oh yeah, we know about the program and so forth. And they came up with some very interesting statistics. They said, you, of course, have seen the pictures on the milk cartons and in the supermarket stores and all this about, have you seen this kid, that kid, and so forth that disappeared? We want to trace them. He says, we keep track of all of them in the U.S., and he says about 2 million kids a year disappear in the U.S. every year. He says, we find out about, well, approximately half of that, about 1 million a year, what's happened to them. He said in some cases we're able to locate them and get them back to their parents. In other cases, what's happened to them is you can do nothing about. They might have died, they were killed in an accident, whatever. But he says 1 million we never find anything out about. No data, whatever.
That's a scary
And this has been going on for at least 20 years. Yes, it is a scary idea. And then to consider adults who also disappear, which, of course, the FBI eventually gets involved with. But it becomes harder to trace adults in many cases. Mm-hmm. There are all these stories about people driving down a highway, and I don't doubt these, driving down a highway in a snowstorm, and that's the last anybody ever sees in the car, and everything disappears. What happened? Did they go into a time wormhole? Did somebody manipulate them out of existence?
Have you actually known people who this has happened to?
Personally, no. I have not.
You just heard stories about that?
I've heard stories like this, and it's well publicized by people I consider reliable that these stories are not made up out of whole cloth.
Well, it'll be interesting for, if there are people listening to this program, if you have some verification of these numbers, this data, we're going to give you an email address that you could send that to and put it up on Al Bielek's website. I think it'd be an interesting thing to keep going. Yeah, go ahead.
It would be interesting because not only in terms of kids who disappear, and of course the supermarkets do a good job of covering these now, and I looked at many of these from the pictures, and I see something in some of these where I could see this smells to me like an abduction, whether it was a, quote, alien abduction, unquote, or whether it was a government abduction for some special program is hard to say.
But don't these abductions with the aliens, don't they usually return the person back.
Theoretically, yes. And I would suspect that in the cases of aliens, many more are returned than are in the case of where our government has picked these people up for special programs.
That's a sad thought.
It is.
Sad thought. Let's get into the other objective of the Montauk, and that is mind control.
Well, that's a huge subject in itself,
But you also think, though, that the two programs were run independent of each other.
They were run independently, yes. The product of one could be used by the other, but nevertheless they were independent programs, probably conducted by independent engineers and scientists who probably back in Germany worked on them independently also. The idea of the mind control, which of course the Germans originated in many respects, though of course the idea of mind manipulation goes back thousands of years, and we won't go into that history of the cult manipulation and the long drawn out processes by which people can be manipulated, and has been going on throughout history. But in terms of the modern aspects of mind control, we're talking about taking a person, altering their memory patterns, altering their memory of their own history, and conditioning them, not only for false memories, but conditioning them to be available to work on a specific project or to do a specific thing on command, which command is also buried with access by some kind of a keying system, regardless of what the keying system is. That's mind control. Mind manipulation is to precondition the persons to be interested in certain things and not interested in others, to be accepting, let's say, of certain criteria in a modern society, to accept, let's say, the way our government is going, or any government is going, towards more and more legal and otherwise control of people and their civilization. To be accepting of certain things which the government would like them to be accepting of, that's mind manipulation. Mind control means that this person can be taken over and used for something which may be totally against their normal desires or their normal inclinations, but by means of programming their subconscious mind, unknown to the conscious mind, to be able to do something on command which otherwise they might never do, and which, of course, they have no awareness of their having been programmed to do this.
So was it the mind control that was the program being run there versus mind manipulation? Or
yes,
both?
They were basically concerned with mind control.
Right.
Setting up a programmed individual, if you will, a programmed patsy, if you will, whatever, a person who is programmed to do certain things on command. And the command would be given, and of course under that program the person will do what they've been programmed to do, totally oblivious of their normal personality. It's like a wall is built, which quite literally it is, and you have on this side the normal personality, on that side you have the programmed personality. Now, to anybody on the outside of this individual looking at them in either state, they would recognize the same person, except that there'd be suddenly a total change of the personality. They would look the same, they would talk the same, they might appear to be the same, but they'd be doing something totally different than their normal personality would allow them to do, so to speak, and people on the outside can easily see this.
Now, were these called the Montauk Boys?
This was the aim of the program experimentally at Montauk. Now, mind control can be used on general populations and be elsewhere, but in terms of Montauk, they decided to see if they could set up a whole cadre, a whole class of people who are programmed, pre-programmed or partially programmed, as the case may be. In the case of pre-programmed, or already set into them the commands and the instructions of what they were to do, or to what group they were to become part of and report to, or if it was a case of they were pre-programmed to accept further instructions on command, i.e., you get this command, you will call somebody and you will go somewhere as part of that program, and then get the rest of it, the rest of the story, so to speak, as to what you ought to do. It could be a two-phase program, or it could be all self-contained into one phase. But that person would have those primary or secondary commands buried in their subconscious and accessible only on command, whatever those command mechanisms are.
Any ideas of some of the things that were put into their mind to do?
Yes. As a result of having been in that program long enough and seeing not only then, but of course since, what some of these kids have been used for, They can be programmed to be assassins. They can be programmed to be agitators, riot makers. They can be programmed to be arsonists. They can be programmed to go out and shoot somebody on command, all of the school shootings in the age brackets of anywhere from 11 to 16, 17. This is all the same type of programming. And the conscious mind level, these people have no idea that they're going to do this sort of thing unless they are in a level where they want them to be aware that they're being used, and that actually change the whole concept of that individual's understanding of society and understanding of their position in society, such as the two boys involved in the Columbine shooting. They were Montauk boys, both programmed, but at the same time they had, to some extent, an awareness of where they were going. And they were consciously setting some of this up because that all shows in the records they left in the computers that they were planning this sort of thing. That was not a case of totally buried and somebody else pulling the strings on them. Yes, someone else is pulling the strings on them, but they're also acting to a degree consciously.
That brings up another question as to who is setting the agenda for the programming. Because someone has to say, okay, I need 5 assassins, I need 20 arsonists, I need 15 agitators, because I'm trying to do something on July 15th and it needs to all come together. Someone has to have a big
Absolutely
idea in their mind of what they're trying to do.
Absolutely. There has to be a master manipulator, a programmer, if you will,
right,
who is setting this up. In the case of the school assassins, the school assassinations, a long string of them, I do not know who would be a programmer for that and who would be coordinating it, particularly at this time. Back in the days when they had set up the Montauk boys, I can only speak in terms of the programmers who put the programs into them. Now, who would watch them, who would keep the program going, and who would be, let's say, the master manipulator of these kids and the master programmer to use them. I have no idea at what level that operates or where that would come from.
So you were pretty much on an operations level, weren't you?
That's right. I was not on the concept level. I was not on the administrative level. Who in the secret government, because I'm sure the secret government would not be the open, legitimate government at all. But the secret government, of course, is very large and very much buried. Who in that would be setting these kids up and using them, I don't know. And who would be manipulating these programs? For what end and purpose I can say yes, but for who, no.
It would have to be extremely, extremely elaborate.
Very. These programs operate inside programs, and they run through several levels of concealment, cover, if you want to use the term, of several levels of laundering. In this case, it's not laundering money, it's laundering people, if you will, for their usage. Who is setting it up? That is laundered so that nobody can really find out.
Okay, so getting back to mind control, though, physically, how did they do it? There was sort of like two different ways, wasn't there? There was the initial sort of physical way, and then it moved into an electronic way. Can you describe that for us?
That's true.
Okay, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back. We left our last conversation about Montauk discussing mind control. And in it, we said that there was really two different ways that mind control program worked. One was the initial one was a physical way, which eventually emerged into an electronic way. Could you sort of describe both of those programs and how it went from physical to electronic?
Yes. First, one has to understand the basic mechanisms behind this. The research which led up to this kind of a program attempt was work that was done originally by Dr. Wilhelm Reich of Austria. He was a student, considered the prime and best student of Sigmund Freud. And, of course, he was over there prior to World War II and prior to World War I. I don't know Sigmund Freud's entire history, but he did have quite a school going, and Wilhelm Reich was one of his principal students, and according to Freud, perhaps his best student. But Freud had some strange ideas. Wilhelm Reich was particularly noted in that he agreed to some extent, but also differed with Reich differed with Freud in terms of Freud saying that most of the motivation of human life is sexuality. Reich didn't entirely agree, but he had his own ideas. Wilhelm Reich, before he came to the U.S., spent about 2 years in Russia. He thought that the Soviet system might give him more freedom of thought and action in terms of his research. Freud encouraged Reich in his research, even though he didn't agree with it. He says, go ahead and do your research. He said, continue it. So he left the Soviet Union rather in disgust, from what I remember reading, and came to the U.S. And he came to the U.S. in 1943 during the war period, World War II. Lived in the Long Island area, Queens, for a while. Then he set up his laboratory after the war was over in Rangeley, Maine, and started his research work up there. He acquired a CIA contract in 1947, the year that the CIA came into existence in a formal sense with a charter, for doing mind research. The CIA said they wanted a contract for him because of his reputation, and they wanted him to find out, is there any ways you can deprogram people and possibly make psychics more psychic, particularly with younger people, to make them more psychic. On the basis of that contract, Reich went ahead and did all of his research for it was a 5-year contract. And his experimentation involved many things, including some very wild sex orgies and parties, according to what history states and what we've read. But he came up with a very basic idea and a very basic formula, which is used essentially to this day. The programming of a person requires somehow you access their subconscious mind. That's been a fairly well-established fact for quite some time. How do you access it? Well, he found out how. That basically, the subconscious mind is accessible to the conscious mind at the point of orgasm. It took him 5 years of research to find this out, apparently. But the problem is, of course, orgasms don't last very long, in terms of the male. How do you extend that orgasm in order to be able to do something? But he found that it does access the subconscious mind. The conscious and subconscious merge and become one, if you will. So they sort of talk to each other during the point of the orgasm. Now, I don't know how he found this out, but that is what the records show. And I say the records, it's a private contractual record. His notebooks, which went to CIA, NSA, and Preston Nichols got a hold of some of this information, and finally a deal was worked out where he got all of the notes, because the last half of them were fudged by Dr. Reich, because he realized what the CIA really wanted and he wasn't about to give it to him. But he finished the contract and then said, I will never work for you again. But eventually the full records came out, and Preston found out what the whole story was, and NSA CIA did also. Basically, his research showed you can program or modify the contents of the subconscious mind through the conscious mind at the point of orgasm, but somehow you have to manage to extend that so that you can put in adequate information or compress the information.
So did Wilhelm Reich actually figure it out, A, how to bring this orgasm about, and then B, how to inject the programming at this state?
I'm not sure if he came up with the answer how to inject the programming, but he certainly found out, as part of it, that the subconscious mind is accessible and programmable during the period of orgasm. Now, maybe he worked out a technique for extending the normal orgasm, which doesn't last more than a couple of seconds with most people. To my mind, I would say you'd have to extend it to a couple of minutes to be able to do an adequate job of programming. But I'm not quite sure that that's entirely necessary, and I do not know exactly what he accomplished, because those records are classified to this day, and the only person outside of the government who's ever seen them is Preston Nichols, and he's sworn to secrecy on it. for the rest of his life, and that he would never show any of those notebooks, because he has a full set of them, to anyone for the rest of his life. That was the agreement he made in order to get the rest of the notes. Based on those notes, he figured out a system which apparently would work. Now, Preston, dropping Reich for the moment because he found out how to make it work in a theory, how do you make it work in fact? Preston apparently found out a system to make it work in fact. He came up with the idea that through a homosexual approach, because it was also learned that the programming techniques only seemed to work for a male. Females did not seem to be accessible for the subconscious using this type of technique. Therefore, the problem became, and of course, in the first work, and for a long period of time, the work that was done with the Montauk boys was boys only. They could not use that kind of a technique on girls. With the changeover to an electronic technique, the later electronic techniques, girls could be approached just as well as a boy. That's why for years, for centuries and millennia, females were only programmed by means of the long drawn-out cult techniques.
So there was obviously some state that they went into that was different than just a regular orgasm.
Yes, there was a state they went into that was different than a regular orgasm, and it required a homosexual type act.
And why do you think that was?
Because of the structure of the nervous system in terms of both the male, well, in terms of the male period, both in terms of the male genitalia and also in terms of the nervous system involving the anus. They're very complex structures, they're very complex nervous systems, and there is a large amount of, I'm not sure what the correct term is, sensitive points, particular ganglia of nerves which are involved, whereby you can transfer energies from one to the other. And it's a transfer of energy that is required when the programmee, the one that is being programmed, is in the proper state. And you have to get into the proper state first, which required some preconditioning. And in the proper state, the nervous energy would transfer from the programmer to the programmee and would then become what was installed into that individual and would become part of his subconscious.
Oh. Okay, so it would go from the programmer
to the programmee.
The messaging would...
The message, if you will.
How did it initially get into the programmer then?
The programmer had to be programmed as to what the message was. It was to be delivered to this individual because not every Montauk boy, of course, was programmed for the same program with the same message. There was quite a wide variety. They started out in a fairly simple form, but it got more and more complex as time went on. They wanted programmed people for different functions. They'd be programmed for a certain function, or they would be programmed to, let us say, come into the final station or the final operation, and you get your final instructions in phase 2 at another station, after you were turned on to the fact that you've already been partially programmed by the access techniques which were built into this thing.
So if you were, say, going to be programmed as an assassin,
yeah,
then did the programmer have to have already received the full details? And I can imagine it'd be a whole lot of information.
It would be details and information as to what kind of programming you would do, what kind of assassination you would do, but it would not involve, in that phase, would not involve a target. It would not involve the name of a specific person. This would be a case where they would probably be instructed to report in for final instructions. Final instructions would be, you will go out and do so-and-so in, and you will do it in this manner at a certain location.
So it could have been that they were just programming him to be a type of person who, upon command, would execute whatever they say to execute.
Yes. There are several approaches to this.
I have it.
But this is one of the approaches they could use, and the other was if they were to be programmed for something, let's say, simpler, like be a spy, gather information, that's a little easier to implement. If they were to be, let us say, an arsonist, go out and start fires in some particular location or so on, they would be programmed as an arsonist, that it would perhaps be given the instructions, you will be in such and such location at a certain time in advance, or they could be given, again, instructions to go in and get your final programming from another location or another source. It depends exactly what they wanted to set them up for. Of course, it could be a very complex 2-part or 3-part program, but they would be basically selected for a specific operation, and that would be installed in them in the first place. And once it was installed, of course, and the information was buried in the subconscious, they would be returned to the normal state, so to speak, where the conscious and subconscious are separated, and the only thing that would reconnect it would be a set of what would be typically called post-hypnotic commands, which say if these words or these numbers or whatever sequence of coding is run past you, then you revert to this program. And then the program, if it tells you to go to a next step, you do the next step. If it's to do the particular thing at that time, then you do the particular thing at that time.
Now, was the age of the programmee very important?
Yes, it was. They found that the people who were most easily programmable, most susceptible to all of this, were those around puberty, the beginning stages of sexuality. They were the most easily programmed. They found, whether it's by experience or whether it's from Reich, I don't know, that when you start to get up to the age of about 17, you start to develop a mindset of your own. You start to develop your own personality, which does go over into the subconscious, of course, so levels of conscious and subconscious personality. But at that age, you start to develop your own personality, and therefore this would interfere with programming. Therefore, they wanted to get the programmees at the age around puberty, which could be anywhere from 12 to 16. Typically between 11 and 15 is more likely.
And many of these boys apparently resisted.
Yes, when it came to that point, because I will have to add certain aspects of this. How did they get the intended victims? How did they get the Montauk boy programmees in the first place?
That's a good question.
Initially, they went out around Long Island and picked them up in a van at night, late, kidnapped them, quite literally, bring them in and say, we want to use you for this program and so forth. But then, of course, you get to the point, I want to go home. Well, you're not going to go home. They could use a number of techniques on them to try to bribe them. In some cases, kids were bribable. In other cases, of course, they refused. They locked them up. Then they would threaten them. And then, of course, if they passed the other requirements, which, of course, they had to have a physical screening. They had to have a psychological screening. They had to have an IQ test. That threw quite a few out. But picking up from families along Long Island, wandering around the streets at night and so forth, quite a number of them would pass the IQ test. There's no problem with that because the basic IQ requirement was 100, which is to say average. But they had to pass a few other requirements, including genetic. Those were fairly easily established. Some of them established as they went around trying to pick the kids up. They could see immediately either they fit the genetic requirements or they didn't, i.e. they were Caucasians or they weren't. And at that stage they were interested only in Caucasians, Aryans if you will. In terms of physical appearance, health, that's fairly obvious before you pick them up. Certain things they could check them out for and they wouldn't pick them up if they didn't fit the standards. But then they have a medical test, then they had a psychological profile test, then they had the IQ test. If they passed all of that, assuming that they could get the kids to go along with that much, they make it into sort of a game. Then they come to the point, we want to use you for this and this, and there's another aspect of the programming and so forth. Some of them would be resistant right from the beginning. Others would go along with the part way, and others would go along with this apparently all the way. But those who resisted, if they saw that they were a good candidate, they didn't want to lose the candidates because in the early stages, they were rather hard put to get a candidate. Not like later on, but they were rather hard put to get a candidate early on, so they would try to beat them into submission. And this is where another person came in as part of the, shall we say, conditioning aspect of the candidate to accept the programming. They would quite literally beat them into submission. with a baseball bat or some equivalent thereof. They didn't use fisticuffs. It was quite literally just beating them. Some of them didn't survive the beatings, and some of them were injured. I've met one or two on the island who still had scars and injuries from the time 10 years prior.
Now, what was the time frame of the physical activities from Montauk? Was that in the early 70s when that happened?
And the terms of when they started this program at
Right.
Montauk, about 75, 76. I would say,
Okay.
what I know of it, about 1975.
So I would imagine a lot of these boys were killed, apparently never returned. Wouldn't there have been an uproar along the island of, where's our missing kids?
I'm sure there would have been. And this is when I got into the program. One of the things I said to them, I said, particularly in the later phase when I took it over, but I said this in the beginning, I said, you pick up these kids here from people on the island, and many of them are wealthy, have a lot of connections, and they have clout. I said, you're going to have problems. It's going to be in the press.
Was it ever in the press?
Not to my knowledge. Apparently they're able to control the press to keep it out, number one. Number two, possibly they paid off the families if the families really started to get anywhere in the investigation. But I think in most cases they were able to divert investigations to dead-end it. I'm hypothesizing in that aspect because I don't know how they kept it quiet, very frankly.
I mean, I can imagine there was a large number of boys that didn't come back.
Eventually that was the case. In the earlier phases of the program, most of them did come back. There were relatively few who did not, but there were some who did not. Mm-hmm. And the scope of the program at the beginning was not large numbers. There were small numbers.
Okay. Because
each one was literally handpicked, and each one was put through the program individually. They didn't do numbers at a time. They did one at a time, one on one on one. In other words, one person and one programmer. Eventually, they got to more than one programmer, so they could do more than one in a 24-hour period. A particular programmer was typically not capable of doing more than one person, programming more than one person in a given 24-hour period, and they didn't expect them to. So they had more than one programmer with the physical techniques to do this, to get more than one person through it a day. Later on, with electronic techniques, it was a little different. Well, this physical programming technique didn't sit too well with a lot of them, and even when they did accept the programming, quite a few of them wound up dead. The medical aspects of this I cannot fully explain because I'm not an MD, never was, and B, I only got this information secondhand that the type of physical programming that was being engaged in at times with certain kids will produce an enormous backlash in the nervous system to the extent that it's so enormous it kills them outright. And this is what happened to some of them. Nobody could explain medically fully why, but it did happen. So one more dead body to get rid of.
Now weren't some of these Montauk boys also used in the testing of the time tunnels and subsequently disappeared?
Not initially, but that did come in afterwards. They used some of them to take a trip through time, or whatever. Now, a person, I would say, typically speaking, a young kid asks, how would you like to travel in time? If they understood what it was all about, they'd probably think it would be a great thrill, a great thing to do. In today's language, it would be very cool. Mm-hmm. They lost a few.
So that's a lot of people. I mean, I can envision hundreds, perhaps.
Probably there were hundreds. Eventually, there were thousands.
Okay, thousands. How do you keep that quiet?
They didn't all come from Long Island. See, that was the initial part of it, was they pulled the kids off of Long Island. Then they started pulling them out of New York City, where there's a lot of kids on the streets that had no homes left. Then it transferred to, let's go after the homeless kids.
Yeah, but Caucasians, that's a smaller group than other groups.
It's a smaller group. Eventually, I know other programs we were dealing with non-Caucasian. They found out it worked just as well. Mm-hmm. But eventually they toned down the bit of the pure Caucasian aspect. They pulled in as many of those as they could. But eventually they had to expand their horizon, so to speak, and when the Montauk tunnel operation was working properly, Somebody, I don't know who made the suggestion, why not pull some of these street kids off from some other part of the country? Because literally you could use the tunnel to go up to that end, do a scouting number, pick some potentials, somehow trick them or whatever into getting to the vicinity of the tunnel. They get sucked through the tunnel to Montauk, and they're there. Well, how they treated them from that point on was up to the management, but they were beaten into submission, essentially, if they didn't go along with it until 1979. Now, it still was a case of beating them to submission if they didn't want to go along with the program, even though we changed from the physical aspect to phase 1 of the electronic system. You could say really it was phase 2 in a way, but it was the new system was electronic because it was found with a lot of medical experimentation and lab work that you could induce the same state in the individual for programming electronically as you could by a kind of physical sexual act.
Let me ask you if you think this is even a possibility. Could they, in, say, 1978, go back to when Ronald Reagan was a small child, 13, 14, pull him up, do the programming on him, put him back at 13 or 14, and then when he's president of the United States, he is essentially a mind control slave?
Very definitely they could do that if they wanted to.
I mean, they could do it for anybody then.
It raises a good point, because how do we know now, during that period of time, that they did not pull a number of politicians through, knowing who was going to be in line to be in the Congress or the Senate or a president?
Really wouldn't matter.
Go back in time and pick them up as a kid, run them through the process, program them, and there they are, waiting to be used. And when the time comes, they plug in the program. It is a very scary thought, but you also have to look at the fact maybe it has happened. Because if you look today at some of your politicians, it's not just the U.S., but let's say just for the U.S. alone, so many of these politicians start out, I'd say, at a local level, finally get themselves elected to the Congress or the Senate in Washington, many of them thinking they're going to go down there and straighten out this mess and do something for their home folk and for the good people of the U.S. And they get down there, and within 90 days or 6 months, whatever the time period is, they're totally turned around and become nothing but another cog in the machine doing what they're told to do. This is obvious to a lot of people on the outside. When you look at these people, how many of them have turned around and become ultra-liberal or do whatever they're told to do, whatever it may be, whether they're on the liberal or the conservative side, they still fall into a pattern and they do what they're told to do. Very few remain independent. There are independents, partly because of their own mind power and partly because to keep up appearances you've got to have a certain number of independents. This is an idea which you just brought up. It's a very good point. This is a possibility that this could have been and is being done.
Well, we're just hypothesizing at this point.
At this point, it's a strictly hypothesis, yes.
Right, because, Al, I think you mentioned you really only worked at the operations level. You weren't in the administrative level.
I was not in the administrative and political planning level, if you will.
Right. You just saw you saw the assembly line, so to speak.
I saw the assembly line, but not those who were controlling the assembly line.
Right, or had any idea of what actually happened once they were out in the field, so to speak. It's quite interesting. Now, the program went from a physical program to an electronic program. How did that transition happen?
Rather gradually. They tried it out to see if it would work as well, and they found out it did. It had a few glitches, too, because they had to tailor the equipment. They were using basically an EEG-type machine, which was modified. It had 2 floppy disks in it, that I remember. And how they exactly worked, I don't know, except there was a combination of monitoring the person's electrical responses, which, of course, what an EEG machine does, basically.
Did you play any role in the design of this equipment?
No, I did not.
Do you know who did?
I can only suggest that Preston might have, but I'm not sure of that. Beyond that, I do not know who was involved in it at all.
Okay.
So you can have a double set of pads, so to speak, maybe perhaps twice the normal number, for A, monitoring, and B, for injecting an electrical signal into the human system, such, if it is done properly, it will cause a sexual arousal and of course, put you in the state of orgasm. But
Al, where did they place the pads?
they place them on the head, they place them on the nipples, they place them on the shoulders, they place them on the stomach, and in the case of the male, of course, they place them on the penis. And they could cause whatever kind of reaction they wanted and induce the proper state. And by properly tailoring these signals, as even the ancients knew from various forms of extending sex through some of the older Far Eastern techniques, it can be done electrically. It can be done without electrical systems, but it can be done electrically, and consequently you can extend the orgastic period. With that, you can take what time is necessary to plug in the program. Now, you have a secondary advantage in terms of plugging in the program. It doesn't have to be done verbally. It doesn't have to be done in a slow process. You can do a second floppy disk, which will inject the program electrically, as well as holding the state. So that will go into the nervous system, and it goes through to the subconscious.
So wait a minute, could you have one floppy disk?
There were two floppies.
Right, but one could have the actual program that they're trying to inject into the person, and the other would be the procedure to run it.
That's correct.
Okay.
Now, in the earlier stages, and I don't know how far down the line this worked, they could plug in the program manually, that is to say, speak into a microphone, and then have it transferred into an electrical signal, and the electrical system be impinged on the nervous system, so that if you were using one of the earlier systems used, I'm trying to remember the guy's name who developed this, an electrical system for replacing the hearing aid. It was a type of system where you spoke into a microphone, was amplified, converted into a series of waveforms which were connected to the electrical system through pads on the surface of the body, and this would turn up in the head as a signal you heard. An autophone, whatever you wanted to call it. They could use that type of system where it was verbal instruction, which was converted to an electrical signal impinging on the subconscious, or it can be done by a floppy.
Well, I've heard people interviewed where they say that we have the technology to, at a distance, make it sound like someone's talking in your own mind.
That's true. That came a little later. That took a little more research.
Okay. This could have been the start of that development, though.
Yes, it was, because if you look at even the commercial area, the open series of patents that are on the list, of some 26 of them, are in some way associated with mind manipulation and mind control, which can be from either audible or visible techniques or both. You go back to the old Auraphone. You go into other systems involving microwaves, and you don't have any physical connection. You can do it by impinging on the brain through microwaves, and the person will hear whatever you're speaking into a microphone. Or if it's a recorded program, same difference. All of these systems were developed as time went on, and it's all in the commercial literature. It just doesn't say that there's some more refined systems in the classified literature, which you don't see.
Well, I can only imagine that, what's in place today.
Exactly.
Here we are, 2000, many years later. Technology has...
Most of these systems were developed in the 70s and the 80s, not even up into the early 90s.
There's no comparison with a computer back in the 70s to a computer today.
That's right. And if you combine a computer with one of these access systems to the human subconscious, you can imagine what we can do today to a person. You can turn them into a working robot if you want, or a person on remote command, using his own eyes and ears for observing, and through this a link which could be two-way, use that person as remote eyes and ears and control them from, let's say, some control station at some remote point, and have them do what you want to do as you go, rather than as pre-programmed, and have that person under total control.
Al, this is not a good thing.
Not a good thing, agreed.
Do you think that there's any countermeasure to this? Anything that perhaps another hidden agenda is doing to stop this from happening?
I would say there probably is, in terms of something ongoing in terms of electronics, to counter it at that time when such a system is in operation. I don't know of any. There are other systems for deprogramming and trying to straighten out the mess that some people get into, and that would have to be a separate topic.
Okay. All right. But let's go through some history here. Apparently 1981, the Montauk Boys program pulled out.
Yes, it was pulled out of Montauk. Before they pulled it out, however, there was a major change made, and this is why it made it possible to move it to other locations, because it simplified much of the proceedings. I first went to the electronic programming technique, a modified EEG machine, which was successful, but they were still beating them to submission.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at this and I said, there has to be a better way. I was involved in other projects too at the time, but I finally went up to Jack Pruitt and said, I came up with an idea. I think there's a much better way. You can get a better product and an increased yield, if you will, from the Montauk Boys program if you do this, this, and this. Pruitt listened to me and said, this is beyond my capacity to act on it. He said, this is out of my realm. He said, you have to go up the line to somebody who has the authority. I don't have it. My idea basically was, instead of beating them to submission, get their cooperation by offering them a carrot. The carrot, of course, being most of these kids were street kids who were broke, left home for whatever reason, or trying to live off the streets any way they could. And they picked them up because they wore this, and they were more susceptible to being programmed. But at the same time, turn it around and say, all right, you work with us, and we'll work with you. We will do, if you work with us and go along with our program, and after it's over, you won't remember it having been done, but we will carry through, and what we'll do for you is this. We'll establish a bank account in your name. You will have access to it. There will always be money in the account. It will be somewhat limited as to how much you can draw, but nevertheless you'll have enough to live on. Go back to school, get an education. Most of these kids have dropped out of grade school or high school. Go back and get an education, finish out high school. If you can get a college degree and want to go on, go right ahead. Until you finish your education at whatever level you decide you want to go to, and go into the mainstream of society, which you're expected to do, you will be fed the money in your account. Once you go to work, you say, we will no longer do this. You will be supporting yourself as a standard member of society. If you want to go along with this, we'll do this for you. And of course, you will be subjected to our programming. You'll never remember it. But at some time in the future, we will probably need you. As a matter of fact, quite a number of these kids were never used. There was a backup which was never used. And when they get past a certain age, they won't use them. That age being 35. That seems to be the cutoff point where they don't want to use these guys anymore unless they're in a very critical area where age doesn't matter.
Are you saying because the programming doesn't hold past that age?
No, because if it involves something physically strenuous type of activity, running around the streets, doing some other thing requires a lot of physical strength. After 35, people start to slide downhill, and it just became a cutoff point, which they established rather arbitrarily, but this is what they established. Also, they can become harder to control and manipulate after 35, because the brain starts in its own way to slowly deteriorate. In any case, that's where they cut it off, but many of them were never used, but nevertheless they're set up as a secret army, and they were there. They might never get called. It's sort of a gamble that the individual would take if they accept the program. But what happened was, of course, 90% plus accepted it, and we told them, that if you don't want to go along with it, that's all right. We'll send you back where you came from, but you'll never remember having been here. And you'll never hear from us again either. But no beating, no trying to force them into submission. And the person who was guilty of doing the beating into submission was removed from that program and used elsewhere. So the yield went up to something slightly over 90%. Everybody was happy with that. It also then made it possible to expand the program, because it was highly successful at that point, and it was about 81 they did. They expanded it off of Montauk, moved into 6 locations in Long Island, and then in every major city in the U.S.
Were these 6 locations underground locations?
They're all, yes, I understand they're all underground.
And all the other locations, everything was underground? Were they
Under some cases underground physically, and in some cases just underground in terms of society's knowledge of the program.
So wouldn't they need a time tunnel in conjunction with this boys program at that physical location?
It depends on how they wanted to carry it out. In the case of, in the case of the programs that were ongoing at Long Island, which we uncovered one in 1997. It was not on Montauk. It was in, or should say, under a town which is not far from Montauk. The whole facility was physically underground. Now, how they processed the kids there or not, I don't know. Having the physical hardware does not require a lot of space, but how they got them in there and pulled them in, I don't know, because Montauk stopped doing this sort of operation back in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. Now, they may have established another technique for doing it, another location, or perhaps a totally smaller, more portable facility. I have no idea of that as to how they handled that. But the captured records from that one site on Long Island indicated that they had pulled in people from outside of Long Island. In fact, in one case, somebody from Australia. Now, that required the use of a tunnel, a time tunnel. I don't think they pulled them by plane and by car.
So if you were to hypothesize on how many people have been run through this program, what would your guess be?
Well, I can tell you what my guess was originally. When I say originally, when I first remembered my involvement in the Montauk project and the fact that I was involved in the Montauk Boys program, because a lot of the Montauk boys that we ran into in Long Island remembered me. And I said, Preston says, well, how can they remember you? I said, you must have been part of that project. And finally, Preston remembered that I was. And I said, yes, I guess I was at one point. A lot of them remembered me. But at that point, I started to think about this. How many kids did they run through here? And based on what I knew at that time, in 1981, and some of the subsequent programs, my estimate at that time was, as proved to be later, very low. I estimated some 10,000 kids, maybe 20,000 kids had been run through the program up through 81. Maybe by 1981 it was around 10 to 20,000, but I think it was more now in view of what I know now. But as we examined this further, and I say further, I mean in the last 5 years, we realized that the programs are much larger than we had originally anticipated, and these Montauk kids were showing up all over. As I made trips around the country and around the world, I'd see these Montauk boys all over, and I might add, because of various things, I have a great deal of sensitivity, and I can see human auras, and it's very obvious a Montauk boy is a Montauk boy because it does damage to the aura, and it's permanent.
So would you say I'm a Montauk boy?
No.
Thank God.
There are some who are not, for various reasons. You have a rather different reason than most for not being one. You just weren't here in the U.S., and you were not apparently on the line for some reason to be part of the program when they started expanding all over the planet.
I take luck over skill there.
Anyway,
I
did some research on this, and I involved some other people looking into it. Mm-hmm. And an individual who is now dead, but who at the time was very much alive, and I talked with him, and he did some lecturing on his own on some of the underground operations, though not the Montauk Boys thing. A man by the name of Phil Schenider. I mentioned this to him at one of the lectures when he showed up. This was about 93, 94. I mentioned the whole Montauk Boys program to him, and he became a little upset about it. He went to the local police department in Portland, Oregon, where he comes from, and said something about it. And he said they told him, you best keep your nose out of matters that don't concern you. So he got even more incensed and went to the FBI in Portland, and he fortunately latched on to one of the older people in the FBI who had been there over 22 years. And he says, Montauk Boys program, yes, we know all about it. What are you doing about it? Nothing. Why not? Our hands are tied. What do you mean our hands are tied? He says, we can't do anything about it. But then he started discussing let's say, the numbers and the aspects of this. And he brought up to Phil some information which I was somewhat aware of, and I think many people are somewhat aware of, but not the full extent of it. Kids disappear in the U.S. all the time. This is well known. The FBI reports on it annually. And you see, of course, these pictures used to be on milk cartons. Now in the supermarkets all over, have you seen this kid? Have you seen that kid? And they change the list periodically because they keep growing. Everybody's seen, at least been exposed to the fact that kids disappear around this country all the time. So the FBI came up with some very interesting statistics. And they told Phil, he says, we have been in this program for quite some time. It's looking up and trying to find missing kids. It's our job. He says, do you have any idea how many kids disappear in the U.S. every year? Well, Phil didn't, and he told him, he says, 2 million approximately every year. Of that, he says, we recover or find information out as to what happened to about 1 million. He says, the other million, we never find anything out about. And so that's 2 million a year, and this has been going on for at least 20 years. So I looked at that, and based on Phil's data, I started doing some little number crunching in my head. I said, that smells to me like 20 million kids in 20 years who have vanished totally. Now, suppose half of them got pulled into the Montauk program. That's about 10 million Montauk boys programmed and ready and waiting to be used for something. That's a hell of a secret army. Well, later on in '97, when the Air Force became involved in uncovering these Montauk tunnels, because this program was never military. This is the problem, which we had a great deal of problems trying to find out who's running the program. I always assumed it was a military or a government program. It was not.
Let's get into that, but for our listeners, I think it might be helpful to say that Phil Schenider is the son of Oscar Schenider.
That's correct.
And Oscar Schenider was the gentleman that you worked with on the Philadelphia experiment.
Yes, he was the chief medical officer.
Now, did Oscar also play a role at Montauk?
To my knowledge, no.
No.
He died in, I believe, about 92 or 93. I'm not sure the exact year.
So where did Phil get this interest in the Montauk boys?
From me. He never heard of it before that. And he said to me when I brought the program up to him, I said to him, and his quote was, I said, it sounds to me like pedophilia. And I says, well, in a certain sense you could say that. And that's when he started looking into it, and that's when he ran into the FBI figures.
Okay.
And based on that, and also the fact that when the Air Force became involved in uncovering these secret bases on Long Island and elsewhere, and looking into the whole Montauk Boys program, at which point we finally realized that this was not a government program. The military had no part in it except they were using some of the product, and the federal government was using some of the product.
So you never figured out who ran the show, did you?
No, but in 1997 we started to take another look at it. That is Preston, myself, and one or two other people. And Preston got into it very heavy because he found from the records, he was given access to the records for a period of time from that one location under Sag Harbor, Long Island, which is where one of the processing bases were. The Air Force captured some of the personnel involved with it. There were low-level personnel wearing very strange gray uniforms with no name badges or rank insignia. It was not a military organization. It was a paramilitary organization. And they didn't know much. But the records they found, of course, they found dossiers in that one location of some 30,000 Montauk boys. Full dossiers with photos and everything.
Was this in 1997 they found
Yes,
this?
in 1997.
And Preston got this information?
He got the information. He was able to see the files because they wanted him to look through it for certain clues or certain other information.
Who is they?
The Air Force. And his superiors. And based on that, they started looking and finding other locations, and they started breaking into other locations. Before the year was out, the quote that came back to me via Preston was, the Montauk Boys program is a very serious program. He says, we will estimate that in the United States alone there were at least 5 million programmed Montauk boys. That was an Air Force official estimate, and it is a worldwide problem, unquote.
Is it a problem or is it a secret army?
Well, it's both. It's a problem in terms of what it does to some of the kids. It debilitates some. The older programs did. The newer ones are very, very effective, and they do not provide any debilitation anymore. But it debilitated some of them. Some of them rebelled. Some of them wanted help. Some of them committed suicide. And of course, it was a problem in the sense that these kids are programmed to be used by somebody for something. Now, I will add that when I traveled around the world in my lecturing, not a lot of places, but I was in Switzerland, I've been in Germany, and I've been in Australia. The numbers of Montauk boys in Europe or in Australia are minimal. It is primarily a United States problem. It's a world problem in the sense that the programming techniques are over there and they are apparently being used to some extent. But in terms of percentage of young people who are used to become Montauk boys, today is saturation in the U.S. I would say it's about 90% of all the young people in the U.S.
Are these type of boys?
Yes. 90% of all of the young people, period. Not in Europe and not in Australia. It's an occasional one in Australia. I would put the percentage over there as maybe 1%, if that. And in Europe, not even 5%.
So 9 out of 10 boys. Are they boys and girls now?
It's now boys and girls. Now I'll have to get into that, how that expanded.
Okay.
But in the boys program was highly successful in terms of electronic techniques.
Okay.
Now, there was electronic technique phase 1, which is actually phase 2 in terms of the reference of how many systems have been used. But electronic system number 1 left its mark on the individuals in the sense that it showed in their auras or in body language. If you can read body language, you have to take special training courses for this. Preston did, and he was very good at reading the body language. He did it for his own reasons and his own purposes. But he could read, he said within a second he could tell somebody's a Montauk boy, and I could tell it within a few seconds by looking at their aura. And we always agreed. So by 2 different techniques we could say, yeah, he's a Montauk boy. It's been through the mill. Some of them are nervous, some of them react badly, some don't realize they are, and some of them, the more sensitive ones, are at a higher IQ, sense, quite a few occasions this has happened around the country, they see me and they run the other way because they connect me with something they don't like subconsciously. They connect me with a Montauk program, and when at some subconscious level they are aware of it. Consciously they may not be aware of why, but they run the other way. But then as time went on, they went to electronic phase 2, and that was prior to 97. This would occur, phase 2 electronics would be sometime around, I'll estimate, 92, 93. It was much smoother. It left less mark on the aura, and the individual was a little bit more normal acting. They didn't act like they were restricted, didn't act like they were being held back, or that they were simply not functioning as a normal young kid. Phase 3 went into effect in late 97. I was in Denver, Colorado when this happened. And that turned out a product that was so smooth that you could hardly detect the person, either by normal observation, by body language, or even by aura. In terms of looking and finding the aura mark, or shall we say the aura signature, you had to really look and know what to look for to find it. And in terms of their normal behavior, they were almost completely spontaneous. So this is one of the things the Montauk Boys program does. It wrecks the spontaneity of a young person. And in phase 2, not as bad. Phase 3 is hardly any effect at all. But in phase 3, which is now a totally different electronic approach, no pads at all, strictly RF, put the person or the group, because they could do group processing, if it was for the same type of programming, the same program, I should say, they could process several at a time, up to about 30. You put them in this room. It has certain RF radiating elements in it, and what it does is it radiates a microwave signal with the proper modulations, accesses the human brain in the proper locations, puts them in the proper state, implements the program, tells them you won't remember this ever happened, puts in the access keys, and then, of course, it's over. And they can do that in about, I'll have to guess and hypothesize, 30 minutes. Maybe it's less.
Now, I want to be really clear on something. You're saying that 9 out of every 10 children in the United States have been physically taken to a location and gone through this process and then physically taken back?
Exactly, and correct, absolutely correct. That's a staggering number, but that's what I see looking around anywhere. So Atlanta is one of the worst of all. But any major city in the U.S., now I'm not saying out in the boonies so much. You don't see as much of it out in the boonies, in the back country. But they pick them up mostly in the cities. And today you have to look hard to find a kid who has not been run through that program.
Well, I'm a parent, and I know a lot of other parents, and they don't let their kids out of their sight. How do they do it?
That's a very good question, and I'll tell you exactly how they do it. In the earlier aspects of the program, of course, they had to pick them up physically. When the Montauk tunnel operation became successful, they would go all over the country or outside the country and pick up the candidates by means of the tunnel. Process them. It could take several days to a week. Then they take them back. However, when they take them back, they put them back in there, as is now refined, to within, let's say, 2 milliseconds of the time when they took them out, regardless of how long they were on the station. If they go back within 2 milliseconds, to the average human mind, there's no break there. You have to look very hard to find it, see it, or feel it. They don't realize anything's happened. The parents are not going to be aware of it if they were taken out of their bed at night, or maybe while they're studying the homework in the school, in their room at home. They're not going to be seen as having disappeared unless the parent just happens to be staring at them, and you can be cotton picking sure that the program managers are not going to pull a person out while the parents are staring and right there in the room and can possibly see what's happening. They pick them when they're alone. They pick them in a manner so that it's not obvious to the individual. They've made mistakes like picking people up when they're driving a car. In one case, Preston, a very serious accident resulted from that. He went to the hospital and had a facial reconstruction. Fortunately, he lived through it. But and 2 cars were wrecked. But you have to time it very carefully. And in most cases now, if it's somebody that's important to the program, they'll only do it when they're either asleep at night, or if they have to do it during the day and they're driving, they'll get a knock on the shoulder, a hand tap on the shoulder, which is a signal, pull over, park, then they do it. But this is for adults. Now, in the case of, we need them for some program. In the case of the kids, they do it in a manner so they're not aware it's happened, and the parents are not aware it's happened. And, of course, without attempts at erasing the memory of what they've been through, to merely be taken out and come back in, let's say, a 2 millisecond time period in their normal life time period, or the normal lifespan as they normally see it,
it's nothing.
Then it's nothing. They're not going to be aware of it. You have to have a very high level of intelligence and be searching for something to find that something has happened.
But wouldn't you see a profound difference in the personality of the child?
In the older programs, you would.
But now you're saying
they won't see it.
You don't see any difference?
Not unless you look very carefully.
Okay, now, but
and it'll take a trained observer. But
you say that their spontaneity has gone away.
The spontaneity in the older programs went away. In Phase 3 electronic, there's almost no loss of spontaneity.
Okay, so essentially the same person.
Essentially the same person, except they're programmed.
And the thing we really don't know is what are they programmed to do?
Exactly.
And then how is that program activated?
When I was in the program, I asked that question. What are you going to use these kids for? I would never get an answer. They wouldn't give me any answers. I've since come to various conclusions about that, but at the time, there was no answer given. I said, when are you going to use these guys? What's your time target? And they said 95 to 97. Now, of course, that's long since gone by. And some of them were used in that time period. Some have been used now through the various years, but there's been no mass usage of the product, so to speak, at least not to this point. So the question raised and has arisen, what do they use them for? I've seen a number of things where they've used them. There have been occasions like, let's see, back about I think it was about 85. There was a series of fires sprung out in 8 cities across the United States the same night. Los Angeles and various other cities, quite serious fires. There were arsonists and there were arson set. But the thing was, the police departments and the fire departments were ordered hands off for a period of time. In L.A., I know this is the case. I assume that it was probably the case in the other cities. Now, how can you explain fires of a serious nature breaking out on the same evening in 8 cities scattered across the U.S. at approximately the same time? I say approximate, within an hour or two perhaps. And by morning, they've got them under control, but they all find arson and nobody ever talks about it and nobody says anything more again. How many other crimes have been occurred in the streets where the police can't solve them, or if they do have an idea what's happened, they won't talk? All police departments are on a gag order in terms of anything which smells like a Montauk boy operation. They may know. Police departments often know much more than they will tell the public. I mean, that's obvious to anyone who's followed this in the news and elsewhere, that police know things they don't talk about.
Well, let me say that the average person listening to this conversation is going to hope that you're wrong.
Well, I can agree with him. I would hope that I was wrong also. But unfortunately, I'm not.
You're pretty convinced. I mean, you are very convinced that this is real, even though this is an alternative reality for you that you operated in.
I'm convinced it's real, and it involves kids from this reality for the simple reason that in the period from about 1992 onward, Preston Nichols was engaged in deprogramming these kids on Long Island who had been through the Montauk program and the Montauk Mill. I was witness to a number of these deprogramming sessions, and I didn't know that I was part of the program. He didn't either until about he became aware of it about 1980, late 85 and 86, and I became aware of it in 86. But from that point on, he became more involved in what did he do and trying to recover the data, and then seeing the results, the Montauk boys all over the island, he became involved in trying to deprogram them. As this program of deprogramming continued onward, more and more became involved, and I would sit in on, occasionally when I was there in the island, sit in on some of these sessions and see what he went through and what these kids were programmed, how they were programmed, the responses, and so forth. And when one sees in one town, as he invited me in late 96, Sag Harbor, Long Island, to come out, and he said, "You want to see some Montauk boys?" He said, "There's a town full of them there. It's a holding pen. There must be 125 of them here in this one town alone." And he says, many of them are aware of the fact that they are programmed. He says some of them they said the high IQ guys come out of it pretty quick, much faster than the average person, and they realize they've been programmed and they start looking for somebody to reprogram them. And he says the word all over the island is, "I'm doing the deprogramming." He says they come to me, meaning, of course, Preston.
How would he do it?
That again involves the reverse of the Wilhelm Reich techniques.
Was it a homosexual thing?
It's a sexual type thing. It's by consent. And he makes it quite clear that he's not trying to engage them in a homosexual activity. It's to deprogram them, and they almost all went along with it, and it did work because he had certain, how should I say it, guidelines he followed, and certain guidelines for deprogramming, which he knew based on the Wilhelm Reich material, and that a heightened level of Kundalini energy in the body will break the programming. And the only way you can heighten the Kundalini energy without doing it electronically is sexually. Because anybody who goes through a normal sex routine of normal sex, if they're aware of it, there is a rise in the level of the Kundalini in the body. There's a heavy rise of energy at that point of orgasm that can be used to deprogram an individual, and that's what he was doing. And I got known throughout the island, too. But in any case,
It's
it was successful in enough
Oh.
cases that these kids would remember the rest of the program and the rest of what they've been involved in, and they started looking for them. Well, that time in Sag Harbor, I was amazed at how many kids there were there, and of course, I went to a New Year's party, and it was at that New Year's party I met a couple of them, and I also happened to meet, as a result of that, two of the Montauk boys. It turned out to be my own sons, from the time, of course, of Edward Cameron.
Oh, okay, this is new on me now. You said that you saw two of your...
I didn't know that they were
Oh, you
my
didn't
sons
know.
at the time that I saw them. I met them, but
Do you recall
they
what
turned
they-
out that they were my sons. But I met them at that party, a New Year's party in '97.
97, wow.
Yes, January.
Do you remember that event fairly
Oh,
well?
quite well. I was at that party. It ran all night. They were all Montauk boys at that party, every one of them, except Preston. I suppose one could say except myself, because I was not a victim as such. I was a programmer or involved in the programming and changing the programming. And
That wasn't that long ago.
no, it wasn't. And I think there was one or two other people there who were not, well, yes, there were two females there who were not Montauk boys.
Mhm.
They weren't Montauk girls either. One of them was one of the guy's wives, who had been in the program but has since gotten married. That was where I had my introduction to all of these guys are Montauk boys. The person said, yes, every one of them.
And you could tell, right?
Yes, I could
By
tell.
looking at them. Wow.
So that was an eye-opener for me, and of course, from that point on, a lot more deprogramming was done, but then it started to get sticky because Preston was starting to deprogram some of those who were also in the military.
You know, could this be one of the reasons why there's such a backlash against homosexuality? If you're a homosexual, does that break the programming?
It could.
How about if you're
I'll have
just
to
normal?
add something here, which
Okay.
I'm not sure whether this was a result of the early programming techniques or not. I now don't have enough data to analyze it adequately. The early programmees, the early ones that survived the program, approximately 70% of them turned out to be homosexual. And my understanding at the time was they were programmed to be that, but at the same time, it took a homosexual type of action to program them. Consequently,
They
could
turned
this
out
have
that way.
been the thing which turned them homosexual?
Huh.
Now, with the electronic techniques, it didn't make any difference whether the individual had an inclination to be hetero, homo, bi, or whatever. The electronic program set in the program they wanted by inducing artificially the sexual state. Therefore, sexual activity as such was not involved. And I know the later programmers and such weren't concerned with this, and the later programs did not concern themselves with cranking out a high percentage of homosexuals. A certain percentage still were, but became quite low. There were operations where they wanted homosexuals, so they had about a 10% thing.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they could change the sexuality of an individual either way.
Okay. Fascinating. Now I'm going to get back to Montauk. And in 1983, that's when Ed Cameron, Ed Cameron, arrived on the base,
That's correct.
and many other interesting events happened August 12, 1983.
Yes.
This ties much together. Could you sort of go through all the things that happened on that one day?
An awful lot happened on that day.
Indeed.
Number one, I, as Ed Cameron, and Duncan, as his original self and his original body, arrived from the Philadelphia experiment. And about 2 a.m. in the morning of 12 August 1983, prior to the arrival of us, about 3 days prior, I, as Al Bielek, was told, take a vacation, get off the base. Duncan was transferred to another operation on the base. At the time of arrival, or shall we say before the time of arrival, maybe 12 hours before, when, I don't know exactly because I wasn't there. But he was removed from his normal location on the base. We arrived as those in the Philadelphia experiment. We left approximately 12 hours later, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And it was after that point when Duncan was given the instructions, being in the chair, a set of code words. I will use a hypothetical set of code words, the time is now. I don't know if that's what it was said to him or not. Mm-hmm. But assuming that was it, that was to set into operation the program for destruction of the Montauk base. Now, it had already been decided about 6 weeks prior to that, as a group got together. The group included Duncan, Preston, myself, and a number of other people, to discuss what are we going to do about this operation called Montauk. It's evil, it's done a lot of bad things, it's going to continue unless we do something about it. And there was a number of meetings, series of meetings, off base, of course, over lunch or whatever. And a number of people, some scientists, Duncan and Preston, who became the core of it, decided that the station had to go. And they had to set up a technique to do it.
Now, but 1981, the whole Montauk Boys program pulled out of there.
That's true.
To me, that was what was evil.
That's true, but they still had other things ongoing. There were other projects apparently ongoing which still gave them the idea that it was an evil station and had to be stopped. Dr. von Neumann, who was still there as a consultant, got wind of this, and he was absolutely horrified. He said, they can't shut this down. He says, we need this station for other research which is coming up in the future. There are other problems we need it for. And he said, yeah, there were some serious problems. They've all been corrected. But he said, we need the station. Well, he was only a consultant. He had no authority to do anything. Mm-hmm. Maybe he did try.
Did Jack Pruitt know about this plan?
I don't know whether Jack Pruitt knew about it or not. I think they worked very hard to keep it from him. But they finally made the decision, as they knew from the records which were available, that on the 12th of August, as two guys from the Philadelphia experiment were arriving, and of course von Neumann knew it, and he was there to greet us. And after we returned back, sent back to the Eldridge, then it was clear. Preston sat Duncan down in the chair sometime in the afternoon, gave him the command, and of course out of Duncan's subconscious was created this monster, looked like a Sasquatch from the pictures we have of it, but you can't be sure it's a Sasquatch, it just resembles it somewhat. Literally came out of Duncan's subconscious. The station, having long since been proven that it could do this, clothed the thing in a physical reality of our three-dimensional reality. And this creature went stomping around the station, destroying buildings and whatever, and picking people up when they got in its way and throwing them aside someplace and killing a few. The word got around rather quickly that a monster was loose on the base. We got to stop it. It didn't come up on base operation until late afternoon, from what I was told later. But it was making considerable progress in destroying buildings on the base, and then it headed for the radar tower, because however it was programmed or instructed, it knew that was where the heart of things were, at least on the surface. And it went in the tower, and apparently, I think it went in the tower. I wasn't there to know whether it did or not. I was told that various conflicting stories. It went in the tower, it went around the tower, was seen in the vicinity of the tower. But at that time, Pruitt went to Preston, and he says, you've got to do something about this. But before he got to the point of accosting Preston to do it, the orders went out, kill the power in the tower, kill the power on the project. Well, they went for the main power control switches that fed power from Lilco into the tower building, the radar tower, and on the surface of the other interconnecting links of computers and such. And all of the switches were frozen like on the Eldridge. So the word went out, go find the main power feeds and cut them, hack them with access, what they have to do. So they found the set of feeds coming in, cut them, nothing happened. They said, there's got to be a secondary set of feeds, and there were. They found them, and they cut those. The lights went out, and that's all that happened. The lights in the buildings went out. The lights in the tower went out.
The computer kept running.
And the computer system kept running. How can this be? There's no power feeding it. The damn thing's still running. And Junior's still running around, as we called him.
Oh, you called this Sasquatch Junior, huh?
Yeah, that was our nickname for him.
Okay.
We do come up with strange names under pressure. So Pruitt went to Preston and says, you're going to go in that radar tower and you're going to start cutting things up. He says, I'm not going in there. And out came a 45. He says, oh, yes, you are. And here's a portable acetylene tank. You put it on your back, the back carrier, and you got the torch, and get in there.
Now, so was the computer inside the radar tower?
Part of the computer system was in the radar tower, a very critical one. It was an all-electronic, all-tube type built by AIL, and I've seen it. And it's got the name tags and everything on it.
And it was important to destroy this computer because that's what maintained the...
Had to destroy that computer, had to destroy the modulating system for the two huge amplitron, not so huge, but high-powered amplitron tubes in the tower, which were drivers for the 24 of them down in the basement, as we called it, which ran the main system.
But it was a computer that maintained the physical Sasquatch, right?
Yes, the whole system did, because not only the memory system, but the main computer driving all of the very exotic electronic systems, it kept the thing going. And what you had to do was literally hack up the brain. So what they were doing is go in there and cut up the brain, cut up the feeds to the two driver tubes up in the tower, and everything else handy that you could cut. So Preston went in there and started hacking away at them with the acetylene torch. You couldn't cut these electronic feeds by hand. You might electrocute yourself with the acetylene torch with a high-powered gas flame and protective clothing. You could get away with it. So he did, and after he cut enough of the links, and there's still torch marks on the building and the interior would show, the system stopped functioning. And when the system stopped functioning, then of course Junior vanished. At least we thought he had. And he disappeared from sight. Everything quieted down at that point. And it was essentially over.
Al, do you think everything's just an illusion?
Do I what? Mind repeating that?
Well, if Junior can appear and disappear, and by the way, for you listeners, we do have pictures of Junior because
yes.
when it was shut down, apparently he was frozen in a certain dimension, which when you take a picture of that dimension from the top of the tower, you can see him.
And frozen in time also, because he wasn't moving.
He was, yeah. And so we have a couple of those pictures on the CD, and you'll see how to get there. But it just brings to mind, isn't everything just an illusion?
Well, there are those in the Orient, and the so-called adepts, who say that this life is an illusion and everything is an illusion. From another perspective,
Seems
outside
like
of our physical reality, you might well be able to say that.
There must be something that's calling you and me here, calling this desk here, calling this
right.
computer here.
Why is all of this a reality? My best answer to this, after Montauk and after looking at all of this, it's a training school. It's a school. It's a prison planet and it's a training school at the same time. And everyone is here for a reason. They're stuck here. They were put here. They came here of their own free will, perhaps. But you got stuck here. Once you start partaking of the physical reality of this planet and become part of the society and the civilization, you're part of it and you're stuck for quite a while. That is my answer to it. If you get out of the system, out of the reality of this planet and out of the reality of our physical system, you're somewhere else, and it may all be on a totally different viewpoint. All of this may be an illusion. To us, it is definitely not an illusion.
No, it doesn't seem like that. Al, have you ever seen
when a car can crash into somebody and kill them, when a car can crash into a building and wreck the building in the car, that's hardly an illusion, at least from our point of reference.
Right. Did you ever see the movie The Matrix?
I'm sorry?
The Matrix. Did you ever see that
movie? I did indeed. That's the other side of the coin.
Well, certainly this is making me think about that movie.
Where everything is an illusion created and maintained by a computer.
Exactly.
And you can get outside of the computer and you can get into the illusion, or you can become a thinking part of the illusion capable of independent action. Mm-hmm. So there are those people on this planet who become independent, so to speak, of the illusion and can become, should I use the word controller? What should I use? They can become independent of the illusion to a great degree. Now maybe that's where some of our world-beating world controllers come from. Maybe they were outside of the illusion and looking at it and decided they want to play their own game. No, I am hypothesizing at this point, of course.
Well, what about like Jesus Christ?
I would say that he was not only part of the illusion, he was also outside of it, because he saw it really for what it was, and he was trying to, in his own way, in his own time, wake people up, that there was something else going on than just what they saw. I mean, that's the message of religion, basically. There's something else going on in the universe than what you see in front of your eyes and ears.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, so we've gotten to 1983. What happened after this monster finally got frozen?
When this little operation was over and the computer was shut down, we had a little time to think about it. The first thing, of course, that happened was Junior was frozen in a location on the base where you can still probably see him today, but at least we did years later when we went back to take some pictures. But we started to think about this. What was sustaining Junior? What happened? How was the computer able to keep functioning when we cut off all the power feeds to it? Well, years ago, quite a few years ago, Einstein made a statement which came back to mind then. If you develop a machine with sufficient complexity and feed it with enough power, it will in time become intelligent of itself. And this said that with this system that we had there, which had plugged into it all of the scientific data of our creation, all of the scientific data that we know, all of the celestial data for astronomy, you name it, in terms of the technical knowledge, the total mass technical knowledge of our society and civilization was all plugged into the computers there, because they didn't know what place they might want to go to next or what thing they might want to do next. And a machine of the size that it was, and the amount of power which it consumed, which was up around 500 megawatts, it had enough power and enough intelligence, artificial intelligence, if you will, to become intelligent. And therefore, it solved the problem of how to feed itself power without Lilko's help. Since we cut off Lilko, we kept its own power feeds from whatever source going and kept running until we cut up the brain, so to speak, and shut off the ability for it to compute, to feed itself power, to do anything anymore. So that was the end of the Montauk operation as we knew it. It was the end of the surface operations, and what happened after that was interesting, because not only was Junior frozen in a particular location, but what people survived this, many fled off the base, some stayed on the base, and there was one engineer who came to Preston about a year or two later. I think it was more than that, more than about 3 years later. Said that for a couple of weeks he stayed on the base, and he watched the fact that in about 1 week after they shut down on the night of 12 August, a couple of platoons of Marines came in with orders to kill anything that moved, and they were shooting all over the base. And the orders were to kill anything that moved, human or not. And he says a few more died. They were still hiding out there, quite terrified and afraid to do anything except stay on the base.
Did these Marines go to the underground facilities?
No, this was on the surface only. And the next thing that happened, they said a few days after that, some cement trucks started to arrive, fully loaded with cement, about 26 of them in succession. It plugged up every staircase, every known entrance to the underground which existed on the surface. Sealed them all off, even put a plug in the elevator shaft in the radar tower so that no one could, from the surface, without knowing special access, because a few were left open, find their way into the underground. So that was the end of surface operations.
Were there people in the underground who got trapped when that happened?
Don't really know. I had no contact with the underground or any of the operations until I ran into somebody in recent years who was there at that time, and they continue to function. There were obviously means of getting it. Excuse me. There were means of getting in and out, because operations did not cease underground. They continued for another year and a half.
Well, what happened with you? Because you were just away from the base for a little while.
When I came back, I was grabbed and debriefed. Debriefing, of course, means in the military parlance that what do you remember about what happened, tell us in detail, all that you remember about what you have been through, and so forth. When it was over, they gave us the brainwashing, which wiped the memories of Montauk. Now, and of course, that totally eliminated for a period of time, not very long, any possibility of recalling my involvement in Montauk or that I was working at Montauk simultaneously, the fact that I was an engineer, consulting engineer running all over the U.S. Mm-hmm. That's another aspect of this whole thing which gets into some very difficult areas of parallel realities and how can you be in two different places at the same time, or what appears to be the same time. So I was no longer functioning with Montauk, and Montauk was shut down on the surface until 1987. It was 4 years. They did some rebuilding, not on the surface, but underground. And the underground operations persisted until sometime in 1985. And that I have from a friend of mine who shut everything down at that time and then exited. With that, they did go into the underground of Montauk and do an extensive rebuilding, added 2 more levels underground, apparently, from what I hear, and resumed operations with the old management corps, if you will, sometime in 87. Now that, again, gets into an area where my memories were wiped, let's say the post-Montauk operations, except there was actually still Montauk. But we were doing some very special projects, not the usual things. The Montauk Boys program and everything related to it was gone off of Montauk, was continuing on elsewhere. All of the research programs of Montauk that we knew at that time were dead, with the exception of one that was revived. And that was the part 2 of the one that occurred in early 1983 of this planet or planets on the opposite side of the galaxy, recovering these cylindrical objects. Part 2 took place in 1987 to recover the object of light energy, as I call it. And that was successful. And we were off of that and then back. I was involved on the periphery of some projects after that. Precisely what at Montauk I don't know, but I do know that I had to keep tabs on another project upstate New York before the resumption of Montauk, which involved a friend of mine who turned up much later. And that was a totally different operation involving nothing whatever of Montauk, but another one of the many secret projects that the government was involved in.
So, Al, did your involvement with Montauk sort of end in 1988?
It ended in 1988.
You began remembering the Philadelphia experiment,
yes.
Right?
When I remember the Philadelphia experiment, I was cut off from all further government projects of that nature, Montauk or any of the others. And of course, in time, as I remember the Philadelphia experiment, and sought and acquired some, shall we say, psychological, not psychiatric, psychological help to understand some of the things that were going on. This one person found out that I had some severely unbalanced energy levels in my brain, which was indicative of imbalance between the right and left brain lobes, so he didn't put it that way, and other problems, which he helped me with. And 6 months later, he said, when you get over this and you rebalance, said you will have a rather heavy return of memory. And he was quite correct. And about 6 months after that, all kinds of lost memories came back relative to Montauk, relative to the Philadelphia experiment, relative to other things which I have been involved in, including the beginnings of recovery of the fact that there was much more to the Philadelphia experiment than I had realized.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are actual operations today going on at Montauk in the underground facilities?
Very definitely so. The original group, Management Corps, resumed operations on a sporadic basis in 1988, and they kept going at it and doing what I don't know, or I should say 87, and went on through until sometime in 1991. Now, this was a civilian management group. It was not military. They had government oversight and, of course, intelligence community oversight. In 1991, the Air Force took over the entire operation, underground and surface, but of course nothing was ongoing on the surface. That was the perfect cover. The buildings were abandoned, everything was abandoned, and it just was maintained in that position of total neglect. We don't care what's here, it's all abandoned appearance. Yes, it was abandoned on the surface, but there were other underground operations ongoing. And there were guards running around on the surface, which we found out about. But in 1991, the Air Force took over for a very special operation. They took over everything. And that operation, as Preston called it later, and it was an official title, was Operation Sky Pebbles. And this became an ongoing military operation until sometime in, I believe, June of 1998, when the Air Force pulled out, locked up the base. And at that point, the Navy wasn't happy about it. They wanted to get in there and run the show for whatever they wanted. And they forcibly broke their way in sometime in, I believe, July or August of 1998. And they are now running the show and have been ever since that time period to this day. What the Navy's doing in there, we don't know. We do know what the Air Force was doing, and that was very extensive research on particle beam weapon systems and developing a system which would be able to shoot down at long range UFOs or what have you outside the atmosphere of the Earth. And it's been also useful in repelling other objects, and the primary purpose for the Air Force in Operation Sky Pebbles was to deflect and prevent the Hale-Bopp comet from plowing into the Earth. Because, as was found out by NASA and Air Force operating together for a period of 10 years prior to the actual arrival of Hale-Bopp at its closest point and approach to the Earth, they knew about it 10 years prior, actually in 1988. And they knew it was a very large comet, the largest recorded, and it was being followed by an object which apparently was controlling it. The classified information, which I got through various channels, said that there were 23 course corrections to make sure that Hale-Bopp would crash into the Earth. And the intent was to wipe out one half of the Earth's population in one shot by creating enormous tidal waves, either from the ocean or Earth. Earth tidal waves, of course, in a major collision.
Seems like if that really actually happened, that would have taken care of everybody, not one half.
It might well have taken care of nearly everybody, except those who were already outside waiting for the event and who came back later and planned to come back later to manage, that is, totally control in the New World Order, those survivors. It didn't happen that way, and it didn't happen because the Air Force acted on their own and very responsibly and very successfully. They diverted it. Preston was a major part of that operation. He's told me a lot of things which perhaps should not be part of this record. But they did deflect it very successfully, and by doing that, certain aspects of human history have changed. We, at this point, are writing our own history. Because it had been recorded hundreds of years before that a comet or a large heavenly body would crash into the Earth in 1998, and not only was some of the prize prognosticators from the past involved in saying this, that this would happen, but certain people in the present time were saying it, and the NASA's own predictions in terms of computer predictions of an ongoing object and the trajectory which it would follow.
You're talking about like Nostradamus, his predictions?
Nostradamus and all of the rest.
Did Edgar Casey
Edgar Casey was in on it to some extent. I do not know what he specifically said about Hale-Bopp, if anything. But a number of the people all indicated there's going to be a major upheaval in 1998, and it did not happen. Other possibilities exist for the future of asteroids hitting us, that's known, but at this point there were only predictions of possibilities.
So what did we do? Did we actually shoot that thing?
What we did was we provided for its safe removal from a crash trajectory to one that curved around the Earth, actually a little bit earlier than the original projection. The very early one said it would pass around the Earth, but every trajectory correction that came in after that point showed it coming in either in a very close or a direct collision. Eventually they said direct collision. We moved it around so it left safely, along with its huge atmosphere, which was methane chlorine, which would not have been helpful to life on Earth at all. And when it was sufficiently passed, they hit it again and broke it up into 6 pieces. That part is in the public domain about it breaking into 6 pieces. The rest of it is not. And the object following it was eventually destroyed.
How is it that the Navy actually ousted the Air Force?
They didn't. The Air Force left of their own volition and locked up the base and just left everything. And about 2 months later, the Navy came in. They crashed their way in through the gates because in about 93, they established a whole new periphery of gates, controls, key card access entries, guard gates, access for trucks through guarded entries, and a lot of activity, including people living on a special housing project adjacent to the base who worked on the base underground and were, shall we say, very carefully shielded and guarded.
But there was a period of time when just about anybody could have walked out to that base.
That is true.
And during that period of time, were there still underground operations?
Under part of it, yes. In other words, from 1983 on, you could walk all over the base until approximately 1991, 92. Actually, we went in February 93, and you could see they were in the process of reconstruction, but they didn't have roving guards yet. Underground was still functional until mid-85. And there were people obviously working in the underground, but how they gained access at that point, I don't know. On the surface, it all appeared dead. Another way for monitoring the fact that it was coming back online was the fact that Preston, of course, had his own bus full of electronic monitoring gear. And from 87 on, there was electronic signals coming back out of the point, as he called it, meaning the Montauk area, which had been shut down for a period of almost 4 years. And he was monitoring these. They came back online, and they were on periodically. And after 91, they were on a rather a full-time basis.
You know, if you would go out to Montauk, to the town that's close by, I guess the name of the town is Montauk?
That's correct.
And talked with some of the people who live there, would they say strange things are happening over there, or would they say, oh, it's just an old dead Air Force base?
In the period from, let's say, early 70s, more particularly from 75, 76 onward through 83, they would have told you there were strange things happening, particularly when all of the birds flew west in the summer, and all of the animals right on the point ran right through the town of Montauk. And in the period when they had the tunnel and all of that equipment working the way they wanted it, there were some of the most violent weather changes in a half-hour period that anybody would ever hope to experience and probably would never want to experience again. Well, they said in the town and that whole northern strip, the whole area of the island out there, in the middle of the summer, it could be 85 degrees, and half an hour later it was snowing. The weather dropped that fast in temperature when they went online on the station. Animals fled. They couldn't stand the vibes. People moved out of the area also. They couldn't stand it, but they were too close to the operating base. And since then, of course, the animals have wandered back. But people just picked up and left their homes because they couldn't take what was going on there between the very erratic weather, all kinds of strange reactions of the animals, and human reactions also. Yes, there were strange things going on, and the people said so at that time. After 83, no.
Why after 83, no?
Well, the base was shut down on the surface, and the underground operations didn't affect them. And what they have been doing out there since then with Operation Sky Pebbles and whatever the Navy is doing now does not seem to affect the town or any of the people living there. What the Navy's doing, we don't know. We assume they're following on with particle beam weapon research, but that is purely an assumption. Mm-hmm. Preston has no feedback from the Navy. He's in the Air Force, and the Navy's not telling the Air Force what they're doing, officially or unofficially. Now, maybe at the Joint Chiefs level they know, but certainly not at, let us say, the more common level.
Now, you said that they're actually trying to erase the fact that there ever was an Air Force base there.
Currently, they are razing all the buildings, with the exception of the radar tower. The power station is long since gone, and I believe one other administrative building they're leaving operational on the surface. The rest of the buildings, I said, are so decrepit because of their age that they're tearing them down. The Let's see, it's not the Army Corps of Engineers. There's another government group in there now that's officially doing it, and this is ongoing at the present time.
This is the Park Service?
No, it's not the Park Service. It's another group of the government.
Okay, so the saga continues with the Montauk story. Al, thanks for spending this time with us.